The air in Paris had a certain chill that evening. It wasn't the typical autumn bite, but something deeper, a cold that seeped into the bones. Below the bustling city streets lay a labyrinth, a world few dared to enter, the Paris catacombs. What began as a solution to the overflowing cemetery centuries ago had become a place of mystery and, for some, fear. Beneath the cobblestones, millions of skeletal remains rested in neat stacks, but the deeper one ventured, the more unsettling the place became. Marcus had heard the stories, the whispered tales of explorers who never returned, the strange occurrences deep in the tunnels. He wasn't one to scare easily, though. He had seen his fair share of strange things while exploring abandoned buildings around Europe, and nothing had ever truly unnerved him. But there was something about the catacombs that felt different, something that gnawed at him, though he couldn't quite place it. Still, the pull was undeniable. Beside him, Clara and David checked their gear. Clara, the team's researcher, had spent months gathering information about the catacombs maps, legends, and accounts from others who had made the journey into the depths. David, the tech expert, fiddled with his camera, testing the night vision and audio equipment. They weren't amateurs. They had prepared meticulously. Yet there was an unspoken tension in the air between them, as if they all knew they were about to cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The entrance was innocuous enough, a rusted metal door hidden in an alleyway, just a few blocks from a busy cafe. As they stepped inside, the noise of the city vanished, swallowed by the echoing silence of the tunnels. The walls seemed to close in almost immediately, their damp surfaces reflecting the faint glow of their headlamps. The narrow passage was just wide enough for them to walk single file, forcing them into a line that felt unnervingly vulnerable. As they descended, the air grew thicker, cooler. The city above faded further with every step, replaced by the oppressive weight of the earth pressing down on them. The first few chambers were filled with neatly stacked bones, arranged in patterns that were almost artistic. It was strange, standing among the dead like this, but it didn't feel threatening. Not yet. Clara moved ahead, her eyes scanning the walls, searching for markings she had read about. "This is where most tourists stop," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, as though speaking too loudly might disturb something. "They never go deeper than this." Marcus nodded, glancing at the map she had provided. It was old, drawn by someone who had ventured far beyond the usual paths. "We're not tourists," he muttered. They had a destination, a section of the catacombs rumored to be unexplored, untouched by modern visitors. Clara had uncovered references to it in obscure historical texts, vague mentions of chambers hidden beneath the known pathways. And it was this curiosity, this need to uncover the unknown, that had driven them to take on this dangerous journey. They pressed on, the tunnels becoming narrower, more uneven. The neat rows of bones disappeared, replaced by jagged rock and crumbling mortar. Here, the tunnels were less maintained. The passageways, feeling more like nature, had slowly begun to reclaim them. The further they walked, the quieter it became. Their footsteps seemed to echo too loudly, as though they were disturbing a silence that had existed for centuries. The deeper they went, the more unsettling it became. At first, it was subtle, the faint sound of dripping water, the occasional shift of loose stones beneath their feet. But soon, Clara began to slow her pace. "Did you hear that?" she asked, stopping abruptly. Marcus and David froze. "Hear what?" Marcus asked, his voice low. Clara turned, her expression difficult to read in the dim light. "I thought I heard footsteps." Marcus smirked. "Probably our own echoing. These tunnels can play tricks on you." But David shook his head. "No, it wasn't an echo," he said, his voice edged with concern. "It was behind us." They stood there for a moment, listening. The silence was deafening now, pressing in on them like the walls themselves were alive, waiting for something. Marcus brushed it off, urging them forward. Let's keep moving. We've got a long way to go. They continued deeper, the tension growing thicker with every step. The air felt heavier, harder to breathe, as if the tunnels themselves were trying to warn them to turn back. Clara kept glancing over her shoulder, her unease infectious. Even Marcus found himself gripping the flashlight a little tighter, his confidence beginning to waver. They had prepared for physical dangers, getting lost, cave-ins, or dehydration, but none of them had considered that something else might be down here with them. Hours seemed to blur together. The tunnels twisted and branched in ways the map hadn't shown, and soon Marcus realized they were off course. They stopped in a larger chamber to recalibrate. The walls were damp, and the floor was uneven, covered with debris from a long-forgotten collapse. David fiddled with the camera again, his hand shaking slightly. "I'm not getting a signal anymore," he muttered. Clara knelt by the wall, tracing a faded symbol with her fingers. "This shouldn't be here," she whispered. "This wasn't in any of the records I found." Marcus crouched beside her, shining his light on the symbol. It looked ancient, worn down by time, but its shape was still discernible, something that resembled an eye, or perhaps a gate. Whatever it was, it didn't belong here. He stood up, his pulse quickening. "Let's move. We need to get back on track." They pressed on, but the further they walked, the stranger things became. The tunnels seemed to shift, the air growing colder. At one point, Marcus stopped abruptly, staring into the darkness ahead. "Do you see that?" he whispered. Clara and David turned to where he was pointing, their lights sweeping across the tunnel. For a brief moment, something flickered, a shadow that didn't belong to any of them, moving swiftly out of sight. David cursed under his breath. "We're not alone down here." No one spoke after that. The silence became suffocating, punctuated only by the sound of their own breathing and the occasional drip of water from the ceiling. They were far from where they had started now, deeper than any of them had intended to go. And in the distance, faint but undeniable, came the sound of footsteps. Not their own. The sound of footsteps echoed unnervingly through the tunnel, growing fainter and fainter, as if retreating into the very walls. The group stood frozen for a moment, not daring to speak, not even daring to breathe too loudly. It wasn't just the footsteps, it was the way they reverberated in the silence. Too distinct, too deliberate to be explained away by their own movements. There was something else down here. Marcus was the first to move, shining his flashlight toward the source of the sound. Nothing. Just an endless tunnel stretching into the dark, winding ahead like the throat of a sleeping beast. He felt a knot tighten in his stomach, but he couldn't let it show. "We need to keep moving," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "If we stop now, we'll lose our bearings for good." David swallowed hard, but nodded, clutching his camera a little tighter. Clara hesitated, her eyes fixed on the shadows ahead, but she didn't argue. She knew as well as they all did that staying in one place down here was worse than moving forward, no matter what lay ahead. The group pressed on, but the sense of unease clung to them like a second skin. The further they went, the more the tunnels seemed to warp around them. The once familiar patterns of stacked bones and skeletal remains gave way to something more chaotic. Here, the walls seemed to twist unnaturally, the bones no longer arranged with care, but strewn haphazardly, as if thrown together by some unseen force. It was as though the catacombs themselves were rejecting their presence. As they walked, Clara found herself falling behind, her mind lost in the labyrinth of tunnels and flickering shadows. She kept hearing whispers, not the sound of voices, but something softer, more insidious, like the distant rustling of leaves or the fluttering of wings. She shook her head, trying to clear it. Focus. She had to focus. David, too, was struggling to maintain his composure. The camera felt heavier in his hands, and the tunnel seemed to press in on him, narrowing with every step. His breathing grew shallow, and he felt the unmistakable weight of being watched. It wasn't the darkness or the isolation that unnerved him. It was the sense that whatever was down here with them wasn't a lost soul or a forgotten spirit. It was something darker, something that had been waiting. They stopped at a crossroads where the tunnel branched in two different directions, both leading into yawning blackness. Clara unrolled the map and studied it in the beam of her headlamp. Her fingers trembled slightly as she traced their route. "We should be close to the chamber I found in the old records," she whispered, though her voice held little conviction. "If we keep to the left." Marcus nodded, glancing down the left tunnel. The air there seemed colder, thicker, as though it had been undisturbed for centuries. "Then that's where we'll go." But as they turned to make their way down the left tunnel, a sudden gust of wind swept through the corridor, an impossible thing. There was no breeze this deep underground. It was sharp, biting, and carried with it a smell of damp earth and something else. Something metallic. "Did you feel that?" David's voice was tight with alarm. Marcus nodded slowly. "Keep moving." The tunnel narrowed as they went deeper, forcing them to stoop slightly as the ceiling closed in on them. The walls were no longer lined with bones, but smooth stone, slick with moisture. The air was so thick it was hard to breathe, and the feeling of being watched grew stronger with every step. Without warning, David stumbled, nearly dropping his camera. He cursed under his breath, reaching out to steady himself against the wall. His hand came away wet, slick with some dark, viscous substance that clung to his fingers. He wiped it off on his pants, his heart pounding in his chest. "Watch your step," Marcus muttered, though his own pulse was racing. His instincts were screaming at him that something was wrong, terribly wrong. But they had come too far to turn back now. Clara stopped suddenly, her light fixed on something ahead. "There," she said, her voice barely audible. At the far end of the tunnel was a doorway. Not just an opening in the rock, but a doorway made of carved stone, with intricate patterns etched into the surface. It didn't belong here. It was too deliberate, too out of place amidst the rough, natural caverns. This was what they had come for. They approached slowly, their footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. The doorway loomed over them, imposing and ancient, as if it had been waiting for centuries to be discovered. Clara ran her hand over the carvings, her fingers tracing the strange symbols. She couldn't make sense of them. None of the research she had done had mentioned anything like this. It was as though they had stumbled upon something far older than the catacombs themselves. Marcus shone his light into the chamber beyond, but the beam barely penetrated the darkness. The room was vast, the ceiling lost in shadow, and the walls lined with what looked like more bones. But these were different, arranged in chaotic patterns, spiraling upward like some twisted art installation. The sight sent a shiver down his spine. Clara stepped through the doorway, her eyes wide with wonder and fear. David followed, his camera capturing everything, though his hands were shaking. Marcus hesitated for a moment, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He could feel it now, the malevolent presence that lurked just beyond the edge of the light. It wasn't a ghost or a spirit. It was something far worse. They had crossed a threshold. Whatever had been following them, whatever had been watching from the shadows, was no longer content to remain hidden. As they stepped into the chamber, the temperature plummeted, and the air grew impossibly thick. Marcus felt a sharp pain in his chest, like a hand squeezing his heart. He gasped, struggling to catch his breath. Then, all at once, the lights went out. Complete darkness swallowed them, thicker than any night they had ever known. The only sound was their own breathing, ragged and panicked. Marcus fumbled for his flashlight, but when he turned it on, it barely flickered, casting only a dim, sputtering light. Clara's headlamp was the same, its glow weak and failing. "Something's wrong with the gear," David whispered, his voice shaking. But before Marcus could respond, the darkness seemed to shift. Shapes moved in the shadows, just beyond the reach of their failing lights. A soft whisper echoed through the chamber, a voice, ancient and unintelligible, yet somehow familiar. It sent a chill down Marcus's spine. Then came the footsteps again. Slow, deliberate, closer. They weren't alone anymore. The footsteps echoed through the suffocating darkness, each slow, deliberate step sending a wave of dread through Marcus, Clara, and David. They were frozen, unable to speak, barely able to breathe as their eyes strained against the blackness. The lights from their flashlights and headlamps flickered weakly, casting only brief, sputtering glows as if the very air around them was devouring the light. Marcus clenched his fist tightly around the flashlight, his knuckles white. He wasn't one to panic, but the oppressive atmosphere in the chamber was suffocating. The walls felt as though they were closing in, and the footsteps, they weren't random. Whatever was making them was coming closer, with intent. "Do you hear that?" David's voice was barely a whisper, laced with fear. His camera hung limply at his side, forgotten for the moment. "It's right behind us." Clara didn't respond. Her breathing was shallow, her eyes wide, darting from side to side as though she could catch a glimpse of the unseen figure in the dark. But there was nothing, only shifting shadows and that terrible, slow rhythm of steps. Then, as abruptly as they had started, the footsteps stopped. Silence pressed down on them, thicker and heavier than before. The chamber was impossibly still, the weight of centuries of secrets hanging in the air. Marcus' mind raced. Whatever was following them, it was watching now, waiting. "We have to keep moving," Marcus said, his voice tight with tension. He pointed the dim beam of his flashlight toward the far end of the chamber, where the walls seemed to curve into yet another tunnel. They hadn't come all this way to turn back now, not when they were so close to uncovering whatever lay hidden in the depths of the catacombs. Clara shook her head, but her legs moved almost mechanically, carrying her forward as though something else had taken hold of her. Marcus and David followed closely behind, their steps quiet, cautious. The tunnel ahead was narrow, the walls slick with moisture and covered in patches of crumbling stone. The air smelled of damp earth and something else, something metallic and old. The deeper they went, the more disorienting the tunnel became. It twisted and turned in ways that didn't match the map Clara had studied so carefully. The walls seemed to shift, the ground uneven beneath their feet, as if the very structure of the catacombs was shifting around them, trapping them in a maze with no way out. David was the first to stumble. His foot caught on something, sending him crashing to the ground with a sharp grunt. "What the ma?" Marcus hurried to help him up, shining his light on the ground. Beneath David's foot lay a pile of bones, but these were different from the ones they had passed earlier. These weren't neatly arranged in the haunting displays the catacombs were known for. They were scattered, broken, as though something had disturbed them recently. David winced as he stood, brushing himself off. "This place is falling apart," he muttered, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. He glanced at the bones again, unease flickering in his eyes. "We need to get out of here," Clara said suddenly, her voice cracking. She looked back down the tunnel they had just come from, but the darkness was impenetrable now, as though the path behind them had simply disappeared. "This isn't right. None of this is right." Marcus agreed, though he didn't say it out loud. He couldn't let panic set in. "We're too far in. Let's find the next chamber," he said, forcing a calm he didn't feel. "Maybe we missed something." Clara didn't argue, but the fear in her eyes was unmistakable. They pressed on, moving faster now, as though the very walls were chasing them. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, the flickering light of their flashlights casting long, distorted shadows that twisted unnaturally against the stone. It was as if the catacombs themselves were alive, watching their every move. Then, up ahead, the tunnel opened into another chamber. But this one was different from the others. The walls were covered in strange carvings, symbols etched into the stone in patterns that Marcus couldn't recognize. They weren't like the historical markings or graffiti they had seen earlier. These were older, more deliberate, almost ritualistic. In the center of the chamber stood a stone altar, cracked and worn with age, surrounded by scattered bones and relics that had been untouched for centuries. Clara stepped forward, her eyes locked on the carvings. "This is it," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of awe and terror. "This is what I was looking for." The air in the chamber was cold, colder than it had been in the tunnels, and it carried a sense of foreboding that settled deep in Marcus' chest. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, and a creeping feeling of dread washed over him. Something was wrong. David raised his camera, but the moment he did, the lens cracked with a sharp snap. He cursed, lowering it quickly. "What the?" Before he could finish, a sudden, piercing sound echoed through the chamber, a high-pitched, inhuman wail that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The sound cut through them like a knife, making Marcus' skin crawl. "What is that?" Clara gasped, stepping back toward Marcus. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. Marcus couldn't answer. His heart raced in his chest as the wail grew louder, more deafening, until it became impossible to think. The sound wasn't coming from anything visible. There was no source, no explanation. It was as though the walls themselves were screaming, the catacombs finally revealing the horror that lay within them. "We have to go. Now!" Marcus shouted, grabbing Clara's arm and pulling her toward the tunnel they had just come from. But as they turned, they saw it. A figure, barely visible in the flickering light of their failing flashlights, stood at the far end of the chamber. It wasn't human, not anymore. Its form was twisted, shadowy, as though it was part of the darkness itself. Its eyes, if they could be called that, gleamed faintly, reflecting the light like some predatory animal. It didn't move, but the pressure in the air around them grew heavier, suffocating. The wail faded, replaced by the sound of ragged breathing close, too close. Marcus took a step back, his body trembling with fear he hadn't felt in years. His mind screamed for him to run, but his feet wouldn't move. Clara was paralyzed beside him, staring in horror at the figure as it slowly, impossibly, began to dissolve into the darkness. Then, in the blink of an eye, it was gone. The silence that followed was worse than the noise had been. It was as though the world itself had stopped. Marcus felt the weight lift from his chest, but the terror remained. What was that? David's voice was a hoarse whisper, barely audible. "We need to leave," Clara said, her voice shaking as she took another step back. "Now." Marcus didn't argue. He knew, deep down, that whatever they had seen wasn't going to let them leave easily. Without another word, they turned and fled back into the tunnel, the chamber behind them disappearing into the blackness as quickly as it had appeared. And somewhere in the distance, the footsteps began again. The footsteps were relentless now, growing louder with every passing second, their cadence erratic yet purposeful. It was no longer the slow, measured rhythm they had heard before. It was faster, more urgent, as though whatever was chasing them was no longer content to watch from the shadows. Marcus led the way, his breathing ragged as they hurtled through the twisting tunnels. The cold, damp air burned in his lungs, and every step seemed to drive him deeper into the maze of bones and stone. Clara was just behind him, her hand gripping his arm as they ran, her wide eyes darting between the darkness ahead and the tunnel behind them, where the faint echoes of footsteps kept pace. David lagged slightly, the camera now forgotten in his desperate attempt to keep up. "We're going in circles." Clara's voice was a ragged gasp as they turned another corner, only to find a wall of skulls that looked far too familiar. She stumbled, nearly falling, but Marcus caught her by the arm and pulled her along. The map she'd been so careful to study was useless now. None of the paths made sense. Every tunnel they took seemed to lead them right back to where they had started, the twisted layout of the catacombs warping around them. Marcus didn't respond. He knew she was right, but the fear clawing at the back of his mind told him one thing: stopping was worse. They couldn't stop, not with whatever it was so close behind. David stumbled again, his breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. "We can't keep this up. We'll get lost for good," he panted. But even as he spoke, he knew they were already lost. The sound of the footsteps behind them grew louder, closer, now accompanied by something else. It wasn't a voice, not exactly. It was more like a low, guttural murmur, barely audible beneath the pounding of their hearts. The words, if they were words at all, were in a language none of them could understand, but the malevolence in the sound was unmistakable. It seemed to wrap around them, pulling at their sanity with invisible claws. "We have to find another way out." Marcus's voice cracked with desperation as they turned another corner, plunging deeper into the catacombs. His flashlight flickered again, the weak beam barely cutting through the oppressive darkness. He felt as though the air itself was turning against them, thickening around them, making every breath a struggle. Suddenly, Clara yanked on his arm, pulling him toward a narrow opening in the wall that they had almost passed. "Here!" she cried, her voice tight with fear. Without waiting for a response, she ducked through the opening, squeezing her way into a narrow side tunnel. Marcus followed, his shoulders brushing against the rough stone walls as he wedged himself into the passage. David was close behind, his flashlight bouncing wildly as he squeezed through the tight space. The tunnel was cramped and uneven, forcing them to hunch over as they moved, but the sound of the footsteps behind them faded slightly, muffled by the narrow walls. Marcus let out a shaky breath, but he knew better than to believe they were safe. Not yet. As they made their way through the tunnel, Clara slowed, her breathing heavy and erratic. "This isn't right," she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. "None of this is right. It's like the catacombs are alive. They're changing." Marcus glanced at her, his brow furrowed in confusion, but he didn't have the energy to argue. The thought had crossed his mind more than once, the way the tunnels seemed to twist and turn, leading them back to where they started, as though they were being toyed with by some unseen force. But he couldn't let himself believe that. There had to be a way out. There had to be. The tunnel abruptly opened into another chamber, much smaller than the others they had seen, but still lined with bones. These bones, however, were different. They were piled haphazardly in the center of the room, not arranged in the careful patterns they had come to expect. The sight was disturbing, as though someone or something had been here recently, rifling through the remains. Clara stepped forward cautiously, her flashlight beam sweeping across the room. "What is this place?" she whispered, but there was no answer. David, his face pale and glistening with sweat, leaned against the wall, trying to catch his breath. "I don't care what it is," he muttered. "We need to keep moving." But before any of them could take another step, the murmuring sound returned, this time louder, more distinct. It was coming from somewhere deep within the catacombs, echoing off the walls, but it was impossible to tell from which direction. The words were still unintelligible, but the feeling they evoked was clear. Whatever was speaking was angry, furious. Then, without warning, the pile of bones in the center of the chamber shifted. Clara gasped, stumbling back as the bones began to move, slowly at first, as though being pushed by some unseen force. But then they moved faster, rattling and shifting, until they were swirling in a chaotic spiral. Marcus stepped back, his heart hammering in his chest as the bones rose into the air, twisting and turning in impossible directions. "What the hell is happening?" David cried, his voice breaking as he stared in horror at the spectacle before them. His flashlight flickered, then went out completely, plunging them into near-total darkness. Only Clara's headlamp remained, casting a weak, trembling light over the scene. The bones swirled faster now, forming a tornado of skulls and limbs that rattled against the walls. The murmuring grew louder, more insistent, as though it was commanding the bones to move, to rise, to become something more. Then, with a deafening crash, the bones collapsed back onto the floor, the sound reverberating through the chamber. The murmuring stopped, replaced by a tense, suffocating silence. No one moved. No one spoke. The only sound was the ragged breathing of the group as they stared at the pile of bones, waiting for whatever had caused the disturbance to reveal itself. But nothing happened. "We need to get out of here," Clara whispered, her voice trembling. "Now." Marcus didn't argue. He turned toward the tunnel they had come from, but something stopped him. A cold, creeping sensation crawled up his spine, and he knew, without looking, that they were no longer alone. Slowly, he turned back to the chamber, his eyes scanning the shadows. And there, at the far end of the room, something moved. It was just a shadow at first, barely discernible in the dim light. But then it stepped forward, revealing a figure cloaked in darkness. It was tall, unnaturally so, with limbs that seemed too long, too thin. Its face was hidden, but its eyes, those eyes, gleamed in the faint light, piercing through the gloom with an eerie, predatory glow. The figure didn't move, but its presence was undeniable. The air around them seemed to thicken, and the temperature dropped even further, the cold biting into their skin. Marcus took a step back, his heart pounding in his chest. "Run," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of his own fear. Clara didn't need to be told twice. She turned and fled toward the tunnel, her footsteps echoing in the narrow space. David followed, stumbling as he ran, his camera forgotten in his haste to escape. But Marcus hesitated, his eyes locked on the figure. There was something about it, something that told him this wasn't over, that even if they escaped this chamber, whatever was following them would still be there, lurking in the darkness, waiting for its moment. The figure tilted its head slightly, as though acknowledging his thoughts. Then, slowly, it began to move toward him. That was all it took. Marcus turned and ran, his heart pounding in his ears as he raced after Clara and David, the sound of his footsteps blending with the echo of the thing behind him. The catacombs weren't just a place anymore. They were alive, and they were angry. And they weren't going to let them leave without a fight. Marcus' footsteps echoed through the narrow tunnel as he raced forward, his mind a blur of panic and dread. Behind him, the ominous presence of the figure seemed to press closer, suffocating him with its cold, heavy aura. The catacombs had become a labyrinth of terror, each turn leading them deeper into the darkness. But running felt futile. No matter how fast or far they fled, the shadows always seemed to close in. Ahead, Clara's breath came in ragged gasps as she pushed herself forward, the dim glow of her headlamp flickering weakly in the oppressive blackness. David stumbled beside her, his face pale and drawn, his eyes wide with the same fear that gripped Marcus. The catacombs were no longer just a maze of bones and stone. They were something far more sinister, a force that had twisted reality into a living nightmare. "We can't keep going like this," David cried, his voice breaking through the deafening silence of the tunnels. "It's like we're running in circles." Marcus knew he was right. He had felt it too, the disorienting sensation that they were being led, funneled into some deeper, darker part of the catacombs where escape would be impossible. But what choice did they have? The thing chasing them wasn't going to stop, and neither could they. Up ahead, the tunnel split into two paths. Clara hesitated, glancing back at Marcus with wild eyes, silently begging for direction. But there was no way to know which way was right. The map had long since become useless, and the tunnels twisted and turned in ways that defied logic. Marcus swallowed hard, his throat dry with fear. "We'll take the left," he said, forcing the words out. It wasn't a choice based on reason, just instinct, a desperate hope that somehow it would lead them away from the nightmare pursuing them. Clara nodded, and without another word, they veered left, plunging into yet another narrow passageway. The air was colder here, the walls closing in tighter around them, and the silence that followed them was deafening. Marcus could still feel it, though the presence. It lingered just behind the veil of darkness, always watching, always waiting. The tunnel led them into a small chamber, one that seemed slightly different from the others they had passed through. The ceiling was lower here, the walls closer, and the arrangement of bones felt deliberate. Neat rows of skulls lined the walls, staring back at them with hollow, empty eyes, and the ground beneath their feet was slick with moisture. "We have to stop," Clara gasped, leaning against the wall, her body trembling with exhaustion. "Just for a minute. I can't keep going." Marcus hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to keep moving, but the look on Clara's face, pale, drenched in sweat, told him they couldn't push much further. They were nearing their limit. He glanced at David, who was hunched over, hands on his knees, gasping for breath. "All right," Marcus said, though his voice was tight with unease. "But just for a minute." They stood in the center of the chamber, the silence around them thick and oppressive. Marcus' flashlight flickered weakly, and he hit it against his palm, trying to coax more life from the failing batteries. The beam brightened for a moment, casting eerie shadows on the walls, but it wasn't enough to push back the overwhelming darkness that pressed in on all sides. Clara slid down to the floor, her back against the wall, pulling her knees to her chest. Her eyes darted around the chamber, never lingering too long on any one spot, as if she was afraid of what she might see if she stared too hard. "What is it?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "What's chasing us?" Marcus didn't have an answer. He wasn't sure there was an answer. Whatever it wasn't something he could explain with reason or logic. It wasn't just a ghost or an apparition. It was something older, darker, something tied to the very foundations of the catacombs themselves. The catacombs weren't just a burial site. They were a trap, a place where the past bled into the present, where the dead were never truly at rest. David, still catching his breath, sank down beside Clara. He was shaking, though he tried to hide it. "We can't stay here. It's going to find us." Marcus knew he was right. Whatever was hunting them, it wasn't far behind. And now they were trapped, backed into a corner in a chamber that felt more like a tomb with every passing second. Then, from the darkness of the tunnel they had come from, came the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate. The echo of each step sent a wave of dread through Marcus' body, and he stiffened, his muscles tensing as his heart pounded in his chest. "It's here," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the approaching footsteps. Marcus' mind raced. There was no other exit, no other tunnel to flee into. They were trapped, and whatever was coming for them was closing in fast. He could feel the weight of its presence pressing down on him, the air growing colder, thicker, with every step it took. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped, just outside the chamber. For a long, agonizing moment, there was only silence. Then, a whisper of voice so soft and so low that Marcus could barely hear it, but he knew it was speaking to him, directly to him. It was the same murmuring voice they had heard before, but now it was clear, distinct. It wasn't speaking in a language Marcus recognized, but somehow he understood the meaning. It was calling them, calling him. "Come," it said, the word curling around him like a cold breath. "Come deeper." Marcus' pulse quickened, his mind screaming at him to resist, to fight. But something about the voice was seductive, pulling at him with a force he couldn't explain. His legs felt heavy, as though they were no longer under his control, and he took an involuntary step forward. "Marcus!" Clara's voice cut through the fog in his mind, sharp and desperate. She reached out and grabbed his arm, pulling him back. "What are you doing?" The spell broke, and Marcus stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest. He blinked, disoriented, the chamber spinning around him for a moment before he regained his senses. "We have to go," David said, his voice shaking as he stood, glancing nervously toward the tunnel. "Now." Marcus didn't argue this time. Without another word, he grabbed Clara's hand, pulling her to her feet, and together they ran toward the other end of the chamber. The walls seemed to close in around them as they moved, the catacombs twisting and warping in ways that defied logic. It felt like the tunnels themselves were trying to trap them, to drag them deeper into the darkness. Suddenly, Marcus stumbled, his foot catching on something buried beneath the dirt. He fell hard, his flashlight tumbling from his hand and skittering across the ground. Pain shot through his knee, but he gritted his teeth and pushed himself up, reaching for his flashlight. But as his fingers brushed the metal casing, something cold and sharp wrapped around his wrist. He gasped, jerking his hand back, but the grip tightened, pulling him down. Marcus' heart raced as he looked up, his eyes locking onto the source of the grip. A hand pale, skeletal, and impossibly strong was reaching out from the ground, its bony fingers wrapped tightly around his wrist. Marcus struggled, kicking and thrashing as he tried to free himself, but the hand pulled harder, dragging him closer to the ground. The dirt shifted beneath him, and Marcus realized with horror that more hands were emerging from the earth, their skeletal fingers grasping at his legs, his arms, pulling him down into the depths. "Help!" Marcus screamed, his voice raw with terror. Clara and David rushed to his side, grabbing his arms and pulling with all their strength. But the hands kept pulling, dragging him down into the darkness, their grip cold and unrelenting. For a moment, Marcus thought it was over. He could feel the ground opening up beneath him, pulling him into the catacombs' final, eternal embrace. But then, with one final, desperate tug, Clara and David yanked him free. The hands disappeared as quickly as they had come, leaving nothing but disturbed earth and a cold, hollow silence. Marcus lay on the ground, gasping for breath, his heart pounding in his chest. His body ached, and his mind reeled from the terror of what had just happened. But there was no time to recover. The presence, the thing that had been chasing them, was still there, waiting in the darkness. "Let's go," Clara said, her voice shaking as she helped Marcus to his feet. "We can't stay here." With trembling legs, Marcus stood, and together they fled deeper into the catacombs, the darkness closing in behind them. The whispers followed. The Myrtles Plantation, nestled in the deep south of Louisiana, stands as a relic of an era long past, an architectural monument woven with tales of mystery and tragedy. Its majestic oak trees, draped with moss, form an eerie canopy over the estate, a picturesque yet haunting sight. But beneath its serene facade lies a history soaked in sorrow, conflict, and unsettling events that would ultimately birth one of the most famous haunted sites in America. Built in 1796 by General David Bradford, a prominent figure involved in the Whiskey Rebellion, the Myrtles Plantation was initially named Laurel Grove. Bradford, fleeing from Pennsylvania after his involvement in the rebellion, sought refuge in the dense Louisiana wilderness. The isolation of the plantation gave him the safety he needed while living as a fugitive, and soon, Laurel Grove became his retreat from the law. Bradford lived quietly, cultivating his land and maintaining a relatively peaceful existence away from the conflicts that had defined much of his early life. However, this peace was short-lived. After receiving a presidential pardon, Bradford was able to resume his life in the public eye. He brought his family to the plantation, expanding it into a larger, more profitable estate. The plantation thrived in the early 1800s, largely due to the labor of enslaved people who worked tirelessly on the land. As was the case with many southern plantations, the prosperity of the Myrtles was built upon the backs of those enslaved, whose names and lives were often erased from history. While the wealth of the estate grew, so did the darker undercurrents that would later manifest in tragic ways. David Bradford's daughter, Sarah Matilda, would eventually marry Judge Clark Woodruff, a man whose influence and ambition brought further success to the plantation. However, prosperity did not shield the Myrtles from the tragedies that awaited. Sarah and Clark's 3 children would not escape the dark fate that loomed over the estate. The Woodruffs faced unspeakable heartbreak, with 2 of their children passing at a young age, casting a shadow over what had once been a place of refuge. The loss of the children marked the beginning of what some believe was the plantation's descent into despair. At the time, life in the South was harsh, with diseases such as yellow fever and cholera sweeping through the region, claiming countless lives. The Woodruff family, despite their status, was not immune to these grim realities. But it wasn't just illness that led to the sorrow surrounding the Myrtles plantation. The 19th century was rife with conflict, and as the tensions between the North and South grew, so too did the unrest within the plantation itself. The enslaved individuals who worked on the estate lived under brutal conditions, and their suffering, though largely hidden from the official records, added to the mounting darkness that seemed to envelop the land. By the time of the Civil War, the plantation was no longer under the ownership of the Bradford Woodruff family, having changed hands multiple times. However, the conflicts of the era did not spare the Myrtles from further tragedy. During the war, the plantation was reportedly looted by Union soldiers, who left behind even more devastation in their wake. The once thriving estate became a place of ruin, and the stories of suffering only grew. As the South struggled to rebuild in the years following the Civil War, the Myrtles plantation stood as a symbol of both the old world and the new. Reconstruction brought changes to the region, but the ghosts of the past, both figuratively and literally, continued to linger in the halls of the plantation. The violence and pain endured during those years left an indelible mark on the land, one that many believe gave rise to the paranormal activity that would later make the Myrtles famous. Though often overlooked in the retelling of the Myrtles plantation's history, the lives of the enslaved people who lived and worked on the estate cannot be ignored. Their stories, full of pain and hardship, are integral to understanding the atmosphere of unrest that pervaded the plantation. While the legends of ghosts and spirits dominate the modern narrative, the real lives of these individuals form the tragic foundation upon which these tales were built. Slavery on the plantation was a brutal reality. Those who worked the land endured long hours of hard labor, abuse, and an existence defined by oppression. The names of most of these individuals have been lost to time, but their suffering remains a key part of the Myrtles' tragic history. Many believe that the unrest of the enslaved continues to manifest in the paranormal occurrences that have been reported over the years. By the late 1800s, the Myrtles plantation had undergone several more ownership changes, each bringing new stories and new tragedies. It was during this period that the legends of hauntings truly began to take hold. Visitors to the estate started reporting strange sightings, from ghostly apparitions to unexplained noises in the night. These early accounts were often dismissed as superstition, yet the stories persisted. The plantation's dark history, coupled with its eerie atmosphere, made it fertile ground for tales of the supernatural. Over time, the Myrtles plantation's reputation as a haunted site grew, attracting both skeptics and believers alike. The plantation itself, despite its beauty and historical significance, seemed forever shrouded in a sense of unease. The land, once a symbol of prosperity, had become a place where past and present collided, with the stories of those who had suffered there refusing to fade away. Of all the eerie tales that have come to define the haunted legacy of the Myrtles plantation, none is as famous or as chilling as the story of Chloe, the The legend of Chloe, an enslaved woman who lived and worked on the plantation, weaves together themes of betrayal, fear, and ultimately, tragedy. Over the years, her story has taken on a life of its own, immortalizing her as one of the most well-known spirits said to haunt the grounds. The legend begins with Chloe's arrival at the Myrtles plantation, though the details of how she came to be there have been lost to time. Some say Chloe was brought to the estate as a young woman, while others claim she had been there for years. What all versions of the story agree on is that Chloe worked inside the main house, serving as a maid to the plantation owner's family. By this point, Judge Clark Woodruff had taken over the estate after marrying David Bradford's daughter, Sarah Matilda. Chloe was said to be a trusted servant, one who had gained a degree of favor within the household. She was responsible for attending to the personal needs of the family, often assisting with the children. However, it is here that the story takes a darker turn, as rumors began to swirl about Chloe's relationship with Judge Woodruff. One of the most pervasive elements of Chloe's tale is the suggestion of an affair between her and the judge. Some versions of the story claim that Chloe had been coerced into the relationship, fearing for her safety and her position within the household. Other tellings paint a more ambiguous picture, with Chloe using her knowledge of the judge's personal life to her advantage, attempting to secure her place within the estate. Regardless of the exact nature of the relationship, the affair eventually came to light. According to legend, when Sarah Matilda discovered Chloe's involvement with her husband, she responded with anger and retribution. Fearing for her life, Chloe began to eavesdrop on the family's private conversations, hoping to learn what fate awaited her. In some accounts, Chloe was caught listening at a keyhole, an act that led to her being punished. It was during this time that Chloe's story took its most tragic and fateful turn. Chloe's fear of being cast out or punished escalated, leading her to make a desperate and disastrous decision. In an attempt to regain favor with the family, Chloe devised a plan to sicken them, hoping she could later provide the cure and earn their gratitude. She baked a cake, lacing it with a toxic substance thought to be oleander leaves. The plan went horribly wrong. Instead of a mild illness, Sarah Matilda and two of her children fell gravely ill after eating the poisoned cake. Within days, they had passed away, their sudden death shrouding the plantation in grief. Chloe, realizing the enormity of her mistake, was consumed with panic. The household was thrown into mourning, and Chloe's role in the tragedy was quickly discovered. Whether through her own confession or a suspicion of others, the outcome was inevitable. The aftermath of the poisoning was swift and brutal. The other enslaved individuals on the plantation, fearful of the consequences that might befall them all, took matters into their own hands. According to legend, Chloe was dragged into the yard and, in a desperate act of self-preservation, was executed by hanging. Her body was then disposed of, cast into the nearby Mississippi River, her life extinguished in a moment of collective fury. But the story of Chloe did not end with her death. Over the years, her spirit has been said to linger at the Myrtles plantation, an enduring presence tied to the tragedy she had a hand in causing. The legend of Chloe's ghost began shortly after her passing. Visitors and residents of the plantation reported seeing a figure of a woman, dressed in a green turban, standing quietly in the shadows of the house. Her apparition would often appear near the spot where she had once stood as a servant, and her face haunted and sorrowful was a reminder of the events that had unfolded there. Many believe that Chloe's spirit has remained tethered to the Myrtles as a result of the violent and unjust manner of her death. She is often described as a restless ghost, one whose presence can be felt in both the light of day and the dead of night. Some claim to have seen her peering through windows, her eyes filled with regret, while others have heard the faint sound of footsteps trailing through the halls, always near the rooms where the poisoning took place. One of the most famous pieces of evidence supporting the existence of Chloe's ghost is a photograph taken in the 1990s. In the image, A figure that resembles Chloe can be seen standing between two buildings, dressed in a long skirt and a headscarf. The photo has been widely debated, with some dismissing it as a trick of the light, while others insist it is proof of the supernatural. Over time, Chloe's legend has grown, with many retellings casting her as a symbol of regret and the consequences of poor choices. Her story, while rooted in tragedy, is also a cautionary tale, one that warns of the dangers of manipulation and betrayal. But for May, Chloe is more than just a ghostly figure. She represents the unresolved tensions of the past, particularly the injustices faced by enslaved individuals like her. While the details of Chloe's life and the events leading to her death remain murky, the power of her story lies in its ability to capture the imagination. It serves as a reminder of the human toll of the era's harsh realities, where lives were often defined by fear and desperation. In recent years, historians and paranormal investigators have tried to separate fact from fiction when it comes to Chloe's story. Some have suggested that there is no historical record of an enslaved woman named Chloe, nor any evidence that Sarah Matilda and her children died of poisoning. Instead, they argue, the family may have succumbed to one of the many illnesses that plagued the South during that time. Yet, the lack of historical documentation has done little to diminish the legend. The story of Chloe, whether grounded in truth or folklore, remains a key part of the Myrtles Plantation's haunted legacy. Her ghost is one of the most frequently reported spirits on the property, and many who visit the plantation still claim to feel her presence. In the end, Chloe's tale is one of the most enduring aspects of the Myrtles Plantation, a story passed down through generations, shaping the reputation of the estate as a place where the past continues to walk among the living. The Myrtles Plantation is not just a historic landmark. It is a place where the past feels unsettlingly close. Over the years, countless visitors, residents, and staff have reported encounters with the unexplained. Whether it's the soft sound of footsteps echoing through empty halls, a sudden chill in the air, or full-bodied apparitions appearing in broad daylight, the plantation's haunted reputation is built upon years of strange and eerie events. The supernatural experiences at Myrtles span generations, drawing believers and skeptics alike to its haunted halls. Those who spend time at the Myrtles Plantation often report that the house feels as if it is never truly empty. From the moment one steps onto the creaking wooden floors, there is a palpable sense of being watched, an invisible presence lingering just out of sight. This feeling has been described by both guests and employees of the plantation, many of whom had no prior knowledge of the estate's haunted history when they arrived. The apparitions seen at the Myrtles vary widely, ranging from faint outlines to fully formed figures. The most common sightings are that of Chloe, whose spirit is said to still roam the grounds. But Chloe is not the only ghost who haunts the plantation. Numerous other spirits have been seen and felt by visitors, each with its own story tied to the tragic past of the estate. One of the most frequently told ghost stories revolves around the spirits of two young girls, believed to be the children of Judge Clark Woodruff and Sarah Matilda. After their tragic deaths, many believe their souls never left the Myrtles. Guests have reported seeing the ghostly figures of children playing in the hallways, laughing softly as they run through the house. Some have even claimed to hear their faint voices at night, calling out to each other or to their long-departed mother. In one chilling account, a guest staying in one of the upstairs bedrooms awoke to the sound of giggling, only to find the figures of two small girls standing at the foot of the bed. The figures vanished as soon as the guest sat up, leaving behind a cold spot that lingered long after the encounter. Others have reported hearing the sound of children's footsteps in rooms that were supposed to be empty. These apparitions are not confined to the inside of the house. Many have reported seeing the children playing in the garden, their dresses billowing in the breeze as they move about the grounds. The sightings of these young girls serve as a haunting reminder of the family's tragic loss, and they are often seen as benevolent spirits, their presence more sorrowful than malevolent. One of the most well-known supernatural objects at the Myrtles plantation is a large, ornate mirror that hangs in the main hallway. According to legend, this mirror holds the spirits of Sarah Matilda and her children, trapped within its reflective surface after their deaths. In the years since, visitors have reported seeing strange, ghostly images appear in the mirror, handprints, faces, and figures that seem to press up against the glass as if trying to escape. It is said that despite frequent cleanings, handprints reappear on the mirror, always in the same spots. Some guests have even claimed to see Sarah Matilda's face staring back at them from the mirror, her expression filled with grief. This haunting relic has become one of the plantation's most famous supernatural attractions, and many who visit the Myrtles make it a point to take a closer look, hoping to catch a glimpse of the otherworldly figures rumored to be trapped inside. The Myrtles plantation is also home to a mysterious piano that seems to have a life of its own. Late at night, when the house is quiet and still, the sound of music can sometimes be heard drifting through the air. Guests and staff have reported hearing the piano's keys being played, even when no one is near it. The melody is often described as soft and melancholy, a ghostly tune that echoes through the otherwise silent house. In some instances, the piano has been seen moving on its own, with the lid slowly lifting and falling as if someone were about to play. Guests who have stayed in rooms near the parlor have been awakened by the eerie sound of the piano playing faintly in the distance. Upon investigation, they find the room empty and the piano undisturbed. This mysterious phenomenon has baffled visitors and paranormal investigators alike, with no clear explanation for why the piano continues to play on its own. Some believe it is the work of one of the many spirits who roam the plantation, perhaps a former resident who enjoyed playing music in life and continues to do so in death. The grand staircase of the Myrtles plantation is a focal point for many paranormal encounters. One of the most frequently seen spirits is that of a woman dressed in antebellum attire, often described as wearing a long, flowing dress. She is most often seen descending the stairs, her hand lightly brushing the banister as she moves silently downward. Guests have reported seeing this apparition both during the day and at night, though she never acknowledges their presence. She seems to be in her own world, reliving a moment from long ago. Some believe this woman is the ghost of Sarah Matilda, forever bound to the house where she met such a tragic fate. Others think she may be a former resident or even a visitor from another era. The sightings of this spectral figure are so frequent that many employees have become accustomed to seeing her out of the corner of their eye, only to look up and find her gone. Her presence is not considered threatening, but rather a sad, silent reminder of the plantation's haunted past. In addition to the sightings of full-bodied apparitions, visitors to the Myrtles plantation frequently report hearing unexplained noises throughout the house. Footsteps are often heard on the upper floors when no one is there, and doors are known to open and close on their own. Disembodied voices, often faint and unintelligible, have been reported in the hallways and bedrooms, as if the spirits of the plantation are continuing their conversations from another time. Shadows, too, seem to move on their own within the house. Guests have described seeing dark, human-shaped figures darting across the walls, only to disappear when approached. These shadows are often seen in the corners of rooms or at the end of hallways, adding to the sense that the Myrtles is a place where the past refuses to stay buried. Another spirit that reportedly haunts the plantation is that of a Confederate soldier. Visitors have seen the figure of a man in a gray uniform walking the grounds, his face stern and focused. He's often seen near the front of the house or by the plantation's gates, as if standing guard. Some believe this spirit may be a remnant from the Civil War, when the Myrtles was looted by Union soldiers. The soldier has never been known to interact with visitors, disappearing as quickly as he is seen. His presence, though fleeting, adds to the eerie atmosphere of the plantation, reminding guests of the many lives that have passed through the estate over the centuries. Over the years, the Myrtles plantation has attracted numerous paranormal investigators, ghost hunters, and curious tourists hoping to document the supernatural. One of the most famous pieces of evidence to come from the plantation is a photograph taken in the 1990s. The image shows what appears to be the figure of a woman standing between two buildings on the property. Dressed in old-fashioned clothing, the figure bears a striking resemblance to the descriptions of Chloe, the plantation's most famous ghost. This photo has been widely analyzed and debated, with some believing it to be undeniable proof of the Myrtles' haunted nature, while others dismiss it as a trick of the light or a case of mistaken identity. Regardless of the explanation, the photo has become a symbol of the supernatural activity at the plantation, drawing even more attention to its ghostly reputation. The Myrtles plantation's reputation as one of America's most haunted locations has attracted paranormal investigators, ghost hunters, and curious thrill seekers for decades. With so many stories of ghostly encounters, strange happenings, and eerie sounds, it was only a matter of time before modern technology was employed to try to capture proof of the supernatural. This chapter delves into the various investigations that have taken place at the plantation and the chilling experiences reported by visitors in recent years. The paranormal interest in Myrtles plantation grew steadily throughout the 20th century, particularly as stories of Chloe and other apparitions circulated more widely. As television shows focusing on hauntings and the paranormal began to gain popularity in the 1990s and early 2000s, the plantation became a frequent subject of investigation. Numerous paranormal teams have visited the site, bringing with them advanced equipment in the hopes of documenting the mysterious occurrences the visitors have been reporting for generations. These investigations have often yielded unsettling results, from eerie audio recordings to unexplained video footage. The plantation has been featured on several high-profile paranormal television shows, which have further cemented its status as a ghost hunting hotspot. However, despite the many investigations, the question remains, are the spirits of the Myrtles real, or are they the product of vivid imaginations and heightened emotions? One of the most commonly reported forms of evidence at the Myrtles plantation is the capture of EVPs, electronic voice phenomena, unexplained sounds or voices that are typically recorded but not heard by the human ear at the time. Investigators have claimed to capture chilling EVPs throughout the plantation, including voices that seem to respond directly to questions. In one investigation, an EVP was recorded in the main hallway near the infamous mirror. When asked if there were any spirits present, a faint voice can be heard whispering, "I'm here." Others have captured sounds of children laughing, which some believe to be the ghostly echoes of the Woodruff children who perished after the alleged poisoning. Many of these recordings are faint and difficult to interpret, but they add to the growing body of evidence that suggests the plantation is far from an ordinary historical site. Some investigators have also reported hearing disembodied voices during their time at the Myrtles. These voices, though not captured on recording devices, have been described as soft whispers, as if someone is speaking from a distant room. These auditory phenomena often occur in the late hours of the night when the house is quiet and empty, further adding to the eerie atmosphere. Another tool frequently used by paranormal investigators is the EMF, electromagnetic field detector, which measures fluctuations in electromagnetic energy. The theory behind its use in ghost hunting is that spirits may emit or disrupt electromagnetic fields, causing the devices to spike in areas where there is no obvious source of interference. At the Myrtles plantation, investigators have reported strange EMF readings, particularly around the staircase and in the bedrooms where many of the hauntings are said to occur. One investigation showed a sudden spike in EMF levels near the grand staircase, the very spot where the lady on the stairs has been seen. Despite thoroughly checking the area for any logical explanation, such as wiring or electronic devices, no cause for the sudden fluctuations was found. These readings are often cited as evidence that something paranormal is occurring, though skeptics argue that EMF spikes can be caused by a variety of natural sources. Still, the consistency with which these anomalies occur in specific areas of the house lends credence to the theory that the plantation is home to something otherworldly. Many visitors to the Myrtles plantation have reported seeing shadowy figures moving through the halls, often darting out of sight just as they are noticed. These shadow figures, sometimes described as human-shaped but featureless, have become a hallmark of the plantation's paranormal activity. Some investigators have captured these shadowy movements on video, though the footage is often grainy and difficult to interpret. In one famous instance, a team recorded what appeared to be a dark figure crossing the hallway, only to disappear into the wall. Upon reviewing the footage, no explanation for the figure could be found, leading many to believe that this was one of the plantation's many restless spirits. In addition to shadow figures, strange orbs of light have also been frequently reported. These orbs are often seen floating near the ceilings or drifting through rooms, their origins unknown. Some have speculated that these lights are manifestations of spirits, while others believe they may be caused by reflections or camera artifacts. Regardless of their cause, the lights add another layer of mystery to the already haunted reputation of the Myrtles. Even outside of official investigations, everyday visitors to the Myrtles plantation continue to report their own unsettling encounters. Some visitors have claimed to feel a sudden cold breeze pass by them, even when all the windows are closed. Others report feeling a distinct pressure on their chest, as though someone is standing too close, watching them. These sensations are often accompanied by a deep sense of unease, or the feeling that they are not alone, even in an empty room. A frequent experience recounted by guests is the sudden malfunction of electronic devices. Cameras and phones often drain unexpectedly, or photographs come out distorted. Some have even reported taking photos that reveal strange anomalies, lights, blurs, or misty figures that were not visible when the picture was taken. These technical disturbances have been attributed to the spirits of the plantation interfering with the devices. Those skeptics argue that these issues are likely due to the age of the building or environmental factors. One particularly eerie story involves a guest who stayed overnight in one of the plantation's rooms. In the early hours of the morning, they awoke to find the figure of a woman standing at the foot of their bed, her face hidden in the shadows. Believing it to be a member of the staff, the guest called out, only to see the figure slowly vanish into thin air. Needless to say, the guest did not sleep for the rest of the night. While the Myrtles plantation has earned its reputation as a paranormal hotspot, there are many who remain skeptical of the ghostly claims. Skeptics argue that many of the so-called paranormal experiences can be explained by natural causes. The age of the plantation, with its creaky floors and drafty rooms, may contribute to the eerie atmosphere. The strange noises and cold spots could be the result of the house settling or changes in air pressure, and the shadowy figures could simply be tricks of the light in the dimly lit halls. Some historians have also pointed out that much of the plantation's ghostly lore, particularly the story of Chloe, may be more legend than fact. There are no historical records that confirm Chloe's existence, and the Woodruff family's deaths, often attributed to poisoning, were likely caused by illness common in the 19th century South. Despite these efforts to debunk the hauntings, the stories continue to capture the imagination of those who visit. For every skeptic, there are countless others who leave the Myrtles plantation convinced they've experienced something unexplainable. Whether it's the power of suggestion, a heightened sense of awareness, or genuine encounters with the paranormal, the experiences of visitors contribute to the enduring legacy of the plantation as a place where the past feels all too close. Ultimately, The Myrtles Plantation's haunted reputation is as much a part of its identity as its architectural beauty or historical significance. The ghost stories that have developed over the years, whether based in fact or fiction, have become an integral part of what draws people to this remote corner of Louisiana. Visitors arrive hoping to experience the supernatural for themselves, to walk the halls where the past seems to linger, and to maybe catch a glimpse of something beyond the ordinary. In this way, the Myrtles Plantation is more than just a historic estate. It is a living legend. The stories of ghosts, mysterious occurrences, and tragic spirits have become entwined with the very fabric of the house, turning it into a place where history and folklore meet. The Myrtles Plantation is not just a relic of Southern history, nor simply a famous haunted house. It's a place where the past, both historical and paranormal, intertwines with the present. Over the years, its reputation has grown from that of an ordinary historical estate to a site of intense public fascination, largely due to its chilling ghost stories and the mysterious aura that surrounds it. As the story of the Myrtles has evolved, so has its cultural significance. This chapter examines the lasting impact of the plantation's haunted history on its community, its visitors, and popular culture. The haunting of the Myrtles Plantation has drawn thousands of visitors from around the world. What began as a historical curiosity has transformed into a major tourist destination, with people eager to experience the eerie charm of this plantation firsthand. The combination of history and the supernatural has made it one of the most visited and talked about haunted sites in the United States. Tours of the Myrtles have become one of its primary sources of income, with special attention given to the haunted aspects of the property. Visitors are regaled with stories of Chloe, the lady on the stairs, the ghost children, and the mysterious mirror. The plantation offers both daytime tours, focused more on its historical significance, and nighttime ghost tours, which attract those with a keen interest in the paranormal. The latter is often described as a spine-chilling experience, as guests are guided through dimly lit halls, encouraged to stay alert for signs of the supernatural. For many who visit, the allure of the Myrtles lies in the possibility of experiencing something unexplainable. Even for those who leave without seeing a ghost, the ambience of the old plantation, with its creaking floors, aged walls, and dark history, creates a sense of mystery that lingers long after they've left. It's this atmosphere that keeps people coming back, hoping for a fleeting encounter with the unknown. The Myrtles Plantation's haunted reputation has seeped into popular culture. Over the years, it has been featured in countless books, television shows, documentaries, and films, each contributing to the plantation's growing mystique. It's a frequent stop on lists of America's most haunted places, and its stories are retold in ghost books, podcasts, and documentaries about haunted locations. Shows like Unsolved Mysteries, Ghost Adventures, and Ghost Hunters have explored the Myrtles, bringing its haunted history into millions of living rooms across the world. These programs typically focus on the plantation's most famous spirits, like Chloe and the ghostly children, and attempt to capture evidence of the supernatural. While skeptics question the authenticity of such shows, their influence on the Myrtles' legacy cannot be denied. Each investigation, each retelling of the plantation's haunted tales, has added another layer to the mythology of the Myrtles. Beyond paranormal TV shows, the Myrtles has also inspired works of fiction. Authors have drawn upon the plantation's haunting legacy, weaving its ghost stories into novels and short stories. The Myrtles has come to symbolize not just a haunted house, but a quintessential Southern ghost story, where history and folklore mix with the eerie atmosphere of a grand old estate. The influence of the Myrtles Plantation has also permeated local culture. The surrounding community, though aware of the supernatural stories, views the plantation with a mixture of pride and curiosity. For many locals, the Myrtles is both a link to the area's history and a constant reminder of the South's complex and painful past. While some embrace the haunted reputation as a point of local intrigue, others prefer to focus on the plantation's role in history, emphasizing its architectural and cultural significance. With the increasing interest in the paranormal, the owners and caretakers of the Myrtles Plantation have worked to preserve not only its historical significance, but also its ghostly legacy. The current owners are keenly aware that the plantation's haunted reputation is a major draw for visitors, and they've embraced it as part of the plantation's identity. In doing so, they've taken steps to ensure that the stories of the plantation spirits continue to be told while maintaining the authenticity and historical accuracy of the estate. Preservation efforts at the Myrtles include maintaining the house in its original 18th and 19th century condition, allowing visitors to step back in time as they tour the estate. The caretakers have worked to strike a delicate balance between honoring the historical importance of the plantation and capitalizing on its haunted reputation. Historical plaques and informational guides focus on the plantation's architecture, its role in the South, and the families who live there, while tours emphasize the ghost stories that have made the Myrtles famous. As part of their preservation efforts, the owners have also been open to paranormal research teams visiting the plantation. These teams often use the latest technology in ghost hunting, from thermal cameras to audio recorders, in an attempt to document the unexplained phenomena that continue to fascinate visitors. By allowing these investigations to continue, the Myrtles Plantation remains at the forefront of paranormal research, further solidifying its status as one of the most haunted places in the United States. At its core, the Myrtles Plantation is a place where history and hauntings are intertwined. The stories of its spirits are inextricably linked to the tragedies and hardships endured by those who lived and worked there. Whether it's the ghost of Chloe, said to be trapped in an endless cycle of guilt, or the spirits of the Woodruff children, forever bound to the house they once called home, the hauntings of the Myrtles are a reflection of the darker aspects of its history. The plantation's connection to the institution of slavery adds another layer of complexity to its haunted legacy. The presence of enslaved people on the plantation, including the figure of Chloe, serves as a reminder of the pain and suffering that occurred on the land. The hauntings at the Myrtles are not just about eerie occurrences and ghostly figures. They are about reckoning with the difficult truths of the past. Many believe that the spirits who remain at the Myrtles are not simply trapped between worlds, but are symbolic of the unresolved trauma and loss that the plantation witnessed over the centuries. For visitors, this connection between history and the paranormal makes the Myrtles Plantation an especially compelling and thought-provoking place. It's not just about seeing a ghost. It's about experiencing a space where the past feels alive and where history is not easily forgotten. The spirits that reportedly haunt the plantation serve as reminders of the lives once lived there, lives filled with both beauty and tragedy, hope and despair. As the years go by, the Myrtles Plantation's haunted reputation only seems to grow. Each new generation brings with it more visitors, more ghost hunters, and more believers eager to experience the supernatural for themselves. The plantation's enduring mystery, its ability to capture the imagination of those who visit, ensures that its ghost stories will continue to be told for years to come. Whether the hauntings at the Myrtles are the result of restless spirits, the lingering energy of the past, or simply the power of suggestion, one thing is clear. The Myrtles Plantation has carved out a unique place in both history and folklore. It remains a place where the line between the real and the unreal, the past and the present, is blurred. A place where the living and the dead seem to coexist, if only for a fleeting moment. To those who believe, the Myrtles offers a rare glimpse into the world beyond, a chance to walk among ghosts and confront the unknown. And for those who leave unconvinced, it remains a beautiful, if eerie, reminder of the South's rich and complicated history. In either case, the Myrtles Plantation continues to cast its spell on all who enter, ensuring that its haunted legacy will live on. The RMS Queen Mary was born out of an ambitious dream to be the greatest ocean liner ever built. In the early 1930s, when the world was grappling with economic hardship and uncertainty, the idea of constructing such a colossal vessel was bold, almost unimaginable. Yet, it was precisely this daring vision that drove the Cunard Line, a British shipping company, to embark on a journey to create a marvel that would not only set new standards for luxury travel, but also stand as a symbol of hope and progress. The idea for the Queen Mary emerged in the late 1920s, a time when competition among transatlantic liners was fierce. The Cunard Line wanted to create a ship that could outshine its rivals, including the majestic ships of the White Star Line, which had previously dominated the market with vessels like the RMS Titanic. Thus, Project 534 was initiated, and the dream of the Queen Mary began to take shape. However, the onset of the Great Depression brought challenges. Financial constraints forced construction to halt in 1931, and for nearly 2 years, the unfinished hull stood at the John Brown and Company shipyard in Clydebank, Scotland, a silent and incomplete giant. In 1934, with government assistance, construction resumed. The project was revived with renewed vigor, and the Queen Mary was finally ready for launch. On September 26, 1934, she was christened by Queen Mary herself, the wife of King George V, and slid gracefully into the waters of the River Clyde. It was a momentous occasion, attended by thousands, and marked the birth of a new era in ocean travel. As the massive ship entered the water, cheers echoed and hope soared. The Queen Mary was more than just a ship. She was a floating palace. At over 1,000 feet long, she was the largest and most luxurious ocean liner of her time, equipped to carry over 2,000 passengers across the Atlantic. Her interiors were designed to rival the finest hotels, with grand ballrooms, elegant dining rooms, and lavish suites adorned with the finest wood, marble, and Art Deco details. Everything about the Queen Mary was meant to impress, to show the world that despite the economic struggles, greatness could still be achieved. Her maiden voyage took place on May 27, 1936, departing from Southampton, England, to New York City. This journey was more than just a passage across the Atlantic. It was a celebration of engineering triumph and luxury. Passengers, including celebrities, socialites, and dignitaries, marveled at the ship's speed, grace, and beauty. The ship's sleek design allowed her to glide smoothly through the ocean, and she quickly earned a reputation for her reliability and style. The Queen Mary set records, winning the blue ribbon for the fastest transatlantic crossing, a title she would fiercely defend. But it wasn't just the ship's opulence that made her famous. The Queen Mary was a vessel of stories, tales of grandeur, romance, and even whispers of misfortune. As she began her service, the ship was a hub of life, carrying passengers across the Atlantic for business, pleasure, and new beginnings. However, not every journey was smooth, and not every story had a happy ending. From the start, there were incidents that left a mark on the ship's history. Mechanical issues, turbulent weather, and even tragic accidents cast a shadow over her early years. While none of these incidents derailed her journey, they hinted at a more complex legacy, a reminder that beneath her polished exterior, the Queen Mary was still a vessel navigating the unpredictable forces of the sea. The ship's design was a marvel of engineering. Her engines were powerful enough to propel her across the Atlantic in less than 5 days, a feat that was considered remarkable at the time. The Queen Mary had everything a passenger could desire: swimming pools, libraries, a grand theater, and even a small hospital. For the wealthy and famous, it was the ultimate way to travel, a 5-star experience that offered privacy, luxury, and unmatched service. Even those in third class or steerage were treated to better accommodations than most ships of the era, reflecting the ship's commitment to excellence. The crew of the Queen Mary was just as important as the ship herself. A dedicated team of sailors, engineers, chefs, and stewards ensured that every journey was smooth and every passenger felt like royalty. The bond between the ship and her crew was special. Many saw the Queen Mary as more than a job. She was a second home, a place where lifelong friendships were forged. For them, the ship was alive, a breathing entity that carried not just passengers, but their hopes, dreams, and fears. As the Queen Mary continued her voyages, her reputation grew. She became synonymous with elegance and sophistication, a beacon of stability in a world that was still recovering from economic hardship. For those who could afford a ticket, stepping aboard was like entering another world, a world of luxury where the problems of everyday life seemed distant. But even as she gained fame and admiration, there were those who whispered about the darker aspects of her journeys. Stories circulated about strange occurrences, accidents, and unexplained phenomena. Some said it was just bad luck, while others hinted at something more, something beyond explanation. The Queen Mary's early years were marked by contrasts, splendor and struggle, celebration and silence. For every grand ball held in her elegant ballroom, there were moments of quiet when the ship seemed almost eerie, as if she was listening to the whispers of those who had once sailed on her decks. This duality would become a defining feature of the Queen Mary's story, a blend of glory and ghostly intrigue that would capture the imagination of those who heard her tale. In the years leading up to World War II, the Queen Mary continued to be a symbol of hope and strength. She connected continents, bridged cultures, and provided a sense of normalcy in a world that was beginning to see the clouds of conflict gather once again. But the Queen Mary's journey was just beginning, and her role in history would soon take a dramatic turn, one that would lead to her becoming a legend, not just as a ship, but as a ghostly figure drifting through the annals of time. As the RMS Queen Mary settled into her role as a transatlantic passenger liner, she quickly became known as the Queen of the Seas. This title was not just a nod to her impressive size and speed, but also a testament to her elegance and the experience she offered. From her maiden voyage onward, the Queen Mary became a symbol of luxury, an oceanic palace that ferried the world's elite between Europe and America, and each crossing further solidified her reputation as the most refined way to travel across the Atlantic. During the late 1930s, the Queen Mary embarked on countless voyages, each one carrying passengers from all walks of life: royalty, film stars, business moguls, and everyday families. The rich and famous boarded her decks to be seen, to be part of a grand experience that was unmatched anywhere else in the world. From the moment they stepped aboard in Southampton until they disembarked in New York City, passengers were immersed in a world of luxury. The ship was not just a means of transportation. It was an event, a journey into an era of sophistication and class. On board, the Queen Mary was a world unto herself. First-class passengers dined in elegant restaurants, their tables set with the finest china and crystal, while world-renowned chefs prepared exquisite meals. The grand ballroom, with its sparkling chandeliers and polished dance floor, hosted lavish galas where orchestras played and guests twirled late into the night. It was here that business deals were sealed, romances blossomed, and friendships were formed. The ship's lounges and bars were filled with the buzz of conversation, the clinking of glasses, and the soft hum of jazz music. But the Queen Mary was not just for the rich. She was designed to accommodate all classes. And while the first-class guests enjoyed the height of luxury, those traveling in second and third class were treated to comfort and style that far surpassed the conditions found on other liners. For many, especially those traveling in steerage, the Queen Mary was more than just a ship. She was a vessel of hope, carrying people to new beginnings in America. The lower decks were often filled with families seeking a fresh start, with children playing in the corridors and parents gazing out at the endless horizon, dreaming of the lives they would build once they reached the other side. The Queen Mary's transatlantic crossings were known for their speed. She quickly earned the Blue Ribbon, an award for the fastest crossing of the Atlantic, a title she held fiercely against rivals like the SS Normandy. It was a time when speed was not just about efficiency. It was a matter of national pride. The race between liners was as much about engineering prowess as it was about prestige, and every voyage was a chance for the Queen Mary to prove her superiority. When she broke the record on August 30th, 1936, completing the journey from New York to Southampton in just under 4 days, she cemented her place as the undisputed leader of the seas. However, it wasn't all glamour and excitement. The Queen Mary's early years were also marked by moments of tension and uncertainty. The ocean, as beautiful as it was, could be unforgiving. Passengers often found themselves at the mercy of the weather, with the ship navigating through dense fog, rough seas, and turbulent storms. While the crew was well trained to handle such conditions, there were times when even the Queen Mary seemed vulnerable. Stories circulated about harrowing nights spent battling fierce waves, with the ship's powerful engines roaring as she pushed through the tempest. These moments, though rare, reminded everyone on board of the unpredictable nature of the sea. Beyond the natural challenges, there were also mysterious incidents that would later feed into the Queen Mary's haunted reputation. Although the ship was celebrated for her safety and reliability, there were tragic accidents, some involving crew members and passengers. These incidents were often downplayed to avoid causing alarm, but whispers and rumors spread among those who traveled on her. Some spoke of unexplained sounds echoing through the hallways at night, shadows glimpsed in empty rooms, and doors that seemed to open and close on their own. For those inclined to believe, these occurrences were more than just coincidences. They were signs that the Queen Mary had secrets, that her history was not as polished as it appeared. Yet, despite these undercurrents of unease, the Queen Mary continued to thrive. Her decks remained crowded with guests, her name synonymous with luxury and adventure. To travel on the Queen Mary was to be part of a tradition, a connection to a world that was fast disappearing. The ship's success was a testament to the people who built her, the engineers who designed her, and the crew who kept her running. The captain and his officers were a mix of seasoned sailors and skilled navigators who took immense pride in their vessel. For them, the Queen Mary was not just a ship. She was a living, breathing entity, deserving of respect and admiration. The Queen Mary's popularity grew with each crossing, and she began to attract not just the wealthy, but also celebrities from Hollywood, politicians, and even royalty. Names like Clark Gable, Greta Garbo, and Sir Winston Churchill graced her passenger lists. During voyages, it wasn't uncommon for the press to gather at the docks, eagerly waiting to catch a glimpse of the famous faces disembarking. The Queen Mary was more than just a liner. She was a stage, and every voyage was a performance, complete with drama, excitement, and a touch of mystery. As the 1930s came to an end, the world stood on the brink of a new era. The storm clouds of conflict were gathering, and the Queen Mary, like the rest of the world, would soon be drawn into the turmoil. But for a few more precious years, she remained a sanctuary of peace and glamour, a place where people could escape their worries and bask in the splendor of a bygone age. Little did anyone know that the ship, which had been a symbol of luxury and leisure, would soon be transformed into something entirely different, her role in history taking a dramatic turn. As the world plunged into the chaos of World War II, the RMS Queen Mary's story took a sharp and dramatic turn. What had been a luxurious ocean liner, a beacon of elegance and leisure, was now repurposed for a new mission. The transformation was swift and urgent. The ship that had once carried the world's elite across the Atlantic would now serve as a vital instrument of the Allied war effort, transporting troops to the front lines. stripped of her elegant interiors and painted a dull gray to make her less visible to enemy forces, the Queen Mary earned a new nickname, the Grey Ghost. The warriors saw the Queen Mary undergo a complete metamorphosis. Gone were the grand dining rooms and glittering ballrooms, replaced with rows upon rows of bunks crammed into every available space. The ship's capacity was dramatically increased to accommodate over 15,000 soldiers, a far cry from the 2,000 passengers she was originally designed to carry. The ship that once offered an oasis of calm and luxury now became a floating barracks, bustling with activity as troops prepared for the dangerous missions ahead. She was tasked with transporting soldiers from America and Canada to Europe, navigating the perilous waters of the Atlantic where enemy submarines lay in wait. The Queen Mary's new role was fraught with danger. During wartime, the Atlantic was a treacherous battlefield, and German U-boats lurked beneath the waves, ready to strike any Allied ship that crossed their path. The Queen Mary, however, had one significant advantage: speed. Her powerful engines allowed her to outrun most threats, making her one of the fastest troop ships in the world. This speed was crucial, as it enabled her to travel without the need for a convoy, avoiding potential attacks by zigzagging across the ocean, a tactic known as evasive maneuvering. Yet, the threat was always there, and every voyage carried an air of tension. In addition to carrying soldiers, the Queen Mary also transported supplies, equipment, and even prisoners of war. Her decks, once filled with the chatter of socialites, now echoed with the sounds of marching boots, military drills, and the constant hum of engines. The crew, many of whom had served during her days as a passenger liner, adapted to their new roles, showing remarkable resilience and dedication. They were no longer serving luxury meals or orchestrating grand events. Instead, they were responsible for the safe passage of thousands of lives, often working under intense pressure and in dangerous conditions. One of the most significant moments during the Queen Mary's wartime service came in 1942, when she was tasked with transporting nearly 16,000 American soldiers to Europe. It was a record-breaking achievement, the highest number of people ever carried on a single vessel. The ship was packed from bow to stern, with soldiers filling every available inch of space. For those on board, the journey was both an adventure and a daunting reminder of the realities they would soon face on the battlefields. Despite the crowded conditions, there was a sense of camaraderie among the troops, and the Queen Mary became a symbol of hope, a vessel carrying them to the promise of victory. Yet, amid the sense of purpose and urgency, there were also darker moments. Tragedy struck on October 2, 1942, when the Queen Mary, while on a mission off the coast of Ireland, accidentally collided with the HMS Curaçao, a British cruiser acting as her escort. The Curaçao was cut in half and sank rapidly, resulting in the loss of over 300 lives. The incident was a devastating blow, and due to wartime secrecy, details of the collision were kept under wraps for many years. The Queen Mary, unable to stop due to fears of enemy attack, had to continue her journey, leaving behind a trail of heartbreak. This event, one of the most haunting in the ship's history, would later contribute to the whispers of ghostly encounters and strange occurrences on board. Despite the tragic loss, the Queen Mary continued her service, undeterred by the dangers of war. She became a vital part of the Allied effort, earning a reputation not just for her speed, but also for her reliability. Her ability to transport troops quickly and safely across the Atlantic was a significant advantage for the Allies, and she was involved in some of the most critical missions of the war. She was even known to have transported notable figures, including British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who used the ship as his headquarters during a secret wartime voyage. Churchill's presence aboard added to the legend of the Grey Ghost, making her a symbol of resilience and leadership. Throughout the war, the Queen Mary traveled across dangerous waters, navigating minefields, evading enemy submarines, and enduring harsh weather conditions. Her decks, once graced by glamorous celebrities, were now occupied by soldiers preparing for battle, writing letters home, or simply trying to find a moment of peace in the midst of the chaos. For many, the Queen Mary was the last piece of home they would see before facing the uncertainties of war. She carried their hopes, fears, and dreams across the ocean, a silent witness to countless stories of bravery and sacrifice. The ship's wartime transformation was not without its share of rumors and eerie tales. Soldiers spoke of seeing figures in the darkened hallways, hearing footsteps when no one was there, and feeling cold drafts in rooms that should have been warm. Some claimed that the ship carried not just troops, but also the spirits of those who had lost their lives on her decks. These stories, though unverified, added to the mystique of the Gray Ghost, hinting at the possibility that the ship had absorbed the memories and energies of those turbulent years. By the end of the war, in 1945, the Queen Mary had transported over 800,000 troops, traveling more than 600,000 miles. She was a veteran, a ship that had not only survived the war, but had played a crucial role in the Allied victory. When peace was declared, she returned to Southampton, where she was greeted by cheering crowds and a sense of relief. The ship, once a luxurious liner, had been a steadfast and formidable gray ghost, proving that even in the darkest of times, she could adapt and endure. The Queen Mary's wartime service marked a significant chapter in her life, a period that showcased her strength, speed, and resilience. But as the world began to heal and rebuild, her role would change once again. The ship that had been a silent witness to war would soon return to her original purpose, yet she would never truly be the same. The experiences of the war, the lives she carried, and the stories that unfolded on her decks had left an indelible mark. The Queen Mary would forever be known not just as a passenger liner, but as a ship that had weathered the storms of history, carrying both glory and ghosts within her steel frame. With the end of World War II, the RMS Queen Mary's mission as the Gray Ghost came to a close. After years of wartime service, the ship was finally allowed to return to her original purpose, transporting passengers across the Atlantic. But the transition back to peacetime was not immediate. The Queen Mary had endured years of hard use, carrying troops in conditions far from the luxury she was built for, and it was clear that she would need extensive repairs and renovations before she could reclaim her title as the Queen of Transatlantic Travel. The post-war period was a time of great change, and so too was the process of transforming the Queen Mary back into a luxury liner. When she returned to the John Brown and Company shipyard in Clydebank, where she had been built, the ship was in need of a complete overhaul. The interiors that had been stripped down to accommodate bunks and military equipment were carefully restored to their former glory. The elegant wood paneling, ornate chandeliers, and plush furnishings were reinstalled, and once again, the Queen Mary's grand ballrooms and dining rooms were ready to host passengers from around the world. It took several months, but by July 1947, the Queen Mary was ready for her rebirth. She embarked on her first post-war voyage from Southampton to New York, her decks filled once again with civilians. For many, this journey was a chance to celebrate the return of normalcy, a reminder that the world was slowly healing. The ship was greeted with great enthusiasm on both sides of the Atlantic, as crowds gathered to watch her arrival and departure, cheering the return of a beloved icon. The Queen Mary's return to passenger service marked the beginning of a new golden age for the ship. During the late 1940s and throughout the 1950s, she once again became the preferred way for celebrities, business executives, and tourists to cross the Atlantic. Stars like Elizabeth Taylor, Audrey Hepburn, and Alfred Hitchcock were seen on board, mingling in the elegant lounges and enjoying the world-class amenities. The ship's grandeur was a reminder of a more refined era, a time when travel was as much about the journey as the destination. During these years, the Queen Mary continued to innovate. The ship underwent updates to her cabins, added new entertainment options, and introduced themed events that drew even more guests. The Cunard Line sought to keep the ship modern and relevant, understanding that the competition was growing. Air travel was becoming more popular, and other ocean liners, such as the SS United States, were vying for the same prestigious clientele. Despite this, the Queen Mary managed to maintain her position as a leader in luxury travel, partly due to her loyal following and partly due to her unmatched blend of style, comfort, and speed. But it wasn't just about glamour and high society. The Queen Mary also played a significant role in bringing families together, especially after the long separation caused by the war. The ship was used for a special series of voyages known as Operation Homecoming, which helped reunite soldiers with their loved ones. Many who had been stationed overseas for years were finally able to return to their families, and for them, the sight of the Queen Mary was a beacon of hope, a sign that their long wait was over. Children ran to embrace their parents, and tears flowed freely as the ship docked, bringing joy and closure to countless families. Throughout this period, the Queen Mary seemed to regain her former glory. The ship was once again a place where memories were made, romances blossomed, friendships were forged, and lives were changed. Yet the ship also carried with her the weight of her past. Passengers spoke of feeling a sense of history as they walked her decks, aware that she had been through so much more than just glamorous parties. Some even reported strange occurrences, doors that seemed to open on their own, the distant sound of footsteps in empty hallways, and glimpses of figures that disappeared upon closer inspection. For those who believed in the supernatural, these were signs that the ship's wartime memories were still very much alive, and that perhaps she was haunted by more than just memories. Despite these eerie tales, the Queen Mary continued to be a beloved icon, her reputation untarnished by whispers of the paranormal. She completed hundreds of transatlantic voyages, setting records and breaking barriers. However, the world around her was changing, and the rise of commercial aviation began to threaten the future of ocean liners. What had once been the most prestigious way to travel was now being overtaken by the convenience of air travel. By the late 1950s, it was clear that the glory days of the great ocean liners were coming to an end. Cunard Line tried to adapt, introducing new marketing campaigns and offering discounted fares. But the decline was inevitable. People could now cross the Atlantic in hours rather than days, and even the allure of luxury could not compete with the speed of jet travel. The Queen Mary, once a symbol of modernity and progress, now felt like a relic of a bygone era. Yet, for many, there was still something magical about the ship, a nostalgia that kept passengers coming back, even if just for one last voyage. As the 1960s approached, the Queen Mary's fate became uncertain. The costs of maintaining such a massive vessel were rising, and with fewer passengers, the financial strain was becoming too much to bear. The ship that had once been a floating palace, the pride of Britain's maritime fleet, was now facing the possibility of being decommissioned. There was a sadness to this transition, as those who had sailed on her remembered the golden days, when every voyage was an event, and the Queen Mary was the epitome of elegance. In 1967, after over 3 decades of service, the Cunard Line announced that the Queen Mary would be retired. Her final voyage would take her from Southampton to Long Beach, California, where she would be permanently docked and transformed into a floating hotel and museum. The decision was met with mixed emotions. On one hand, it was a relief that the ship would not be scrapped. On the other, it marked the end of an era. The Queen Mary would never again glide across the Atlantic, racing against the clock and the tides. Instead, she would remain still, a monument to a different time. Her final voyage, which began on October 31st, 1967, was an emotional one. Passengers, many of whom had sailed on the Queen Mary for decades, gathered to bid her farewell. There was music, laughter, and tears as the ship made her way across the ocean one last time. Upon her arrival in Long Beach, she was greeted by crowds who had gathered to welcome her to her new home. Though she would never again set sail, she was not forgotten. The Queen Mary had become a legend, a ship that had weathered storms, carried troops, and brought joy to millions. And now, she would continue to do so, albeit in a different form. The transformation into a hotel and museum was not just a way to preserve the ship, but also to keep her stories alive. Visitors could walk her decks, explore her staterooms, and learn about her incredible history. The Queen Mary, now permanently moored, became a place where the past could be experienced firsthand, where guests could step back in time and feel a connection to the people who had once sailed on her. It was a new chapter for the ship, but one that still honored her legacy. The RMS Queen Mary's transformation into a stationary hotel and museum marked the beginning of a new chapter, but it also sparked a new wave of interest in the ship's long and storied history. While she no longer sailed the seas, the Queen Mary continued to capture the imagination of people from around the world. Docked in Long Beach, California, she stood as a majestic monument to the golden age of ocean liners, a floating time capsule that held countless stories within her steel hull. Yet, along with her grand legacy came a darker, more mysterious side one that would solidify her reputation as one of the most haunted locations in the world. Almost immediately after the Queen Mary was converted into a hotel, stories began to emerge about unexplained phenomena and eerie occurrences. Guests and staff alike reported hearing strange noises, feeling sudden drops in temperature, and even seeing apparitions. The ship had always been steeped in history, but now it seemed as though some of that history was still very much alive. Visitors would describe hearing footsteps echoing through empty hallways, doors creaking open on their own, and the distant sound of a child's laughter coming from nowhere. What was once a symbol of luxury and power had now become a source of intrigue for those fascinated by the supernatural. The tales of ghostly encounters were not entirely unexpected. After all, the Queen Mary had seen her share of tragedy. During her decades of service, accidents had occurred and lives had been lost. Some of these incidents were well documented, like the tragic collision with the HMS Curaçao during World War II, while others were less publicized but equally chilling. One of the most famous tales involves a young crewman named John Petter, who was crushed by a heavy door in the engine room. Since then, many have claimed to see his spirit lingering near the area where he met his end, dressed in the same blue coveralls he wore on that fateful day. Another well-known story centers around the ship's swimming pool. In the days of her service as a luxury liner, the pool was a place of joy and relaxation, where passengers could escape the stress of long voyages. But after the ship became a hotel, strange occurrences started happening there. Visitors reported seeing wet footprints leading away from the edge of the pool, even though it had been drained for years. Some even claimed to have seen ghostly figures, including a young girl clutching a teddy bear, wandering the pool deck. Whether these sightings were genuine or the product of overactive imaginations, they added to the Queen Mary's reputation as a place where the past refused to fade away. As word spread, the Queen Mary began to attract paranormal investigators, ghost hunters, and thrill seekers eager to experience the ship's reputed hauntings for themselves. Documentaries, television specials, and guided tours were organized, each delving into the ship's dark history and exploring the possibility of life after death. The Ghosts and Legends Tour became one of the most popular attractions, offering visitors a chance to explore the ship's most haunted areas while hearing stories of her eerie past. For some, it was a way to connect with history. For others, it was a thrilling escape into the unknown. The Queen Mary's status as a paranormal hotspot only grew with time. Numerous accounts surfaced, each adding to the ship's legend. There were stories of shadowy figures seen slipping through doorways, whispers heard in empty rooms, and even the sensation of being touched by unseen hands. The ship's engine room, where so many had labored during the war, became known as a particularly active area for such sightings. There was something about the place, the dim lighting, the echoing clanks, the feeling of being watched, that unnerved even the most skeptical visitors. Not all of the stories could be easily explained away, and this only fueled the speculation. Were these experiences simply the result of overactive imaginations, or did they hint at something deeper? For those who believed, the Queen Mary was more than just a ship. She was a portal to the past, a vessel that had absorbed the energy of everyone who had ever walked her decks. And for the skeptics, the stories were still intriguing, a way to draw people in and keep the Queen Mary's legacy alive in the modern world. In addition to the paranormal tales, the Queen Mary's legacy was preserved through her role as a floating museum. Exhibits were set up to honor her rich history, with artifacts from her days as a luxury liner, a wartime troop ship, and a cultural icon. Visitors could explore the grand staterooms, marvel at the Art Deco architecture, and learn about the countless lives that had been touched by the ship. For those who had never experienced the golden age of ocean travel, walking through the Queen Mary was like stepping into another world, a chance to see firsthand what it was like to sail across the Atlantic in style. Yet, the ship was not without her challenges. As the years went on, maintaining such a massive structure became increasingly difficult. The wear and tear of time, combined with the constant flow of visitors, took a toll on the Queen Mary. Restoration efforts were made to preserve her, but there were always new issues to address. Leaks, rust, and structural concerns became ongoing battles, each a reminder that even the strongest legends are not immune to the passage of time. Despite these challenges, the Queen Mary remained a beloved landmark, cherished by those who sought to keep her memory alive. Her story was one of resilience, adaptation, and survival, much like the people she had carried across the seas. She had been a part of joyous celebrations, somber goodbyes, and everything in between. The ship had seen the world change, from the roaring 20s to the dawn of the Jet Age, and she had been a part of it all. Today, the Queen Mary stands as a testament to an era that has long since passed. She is a symbol of human ingenuity, a reminder of the power of dreams, and for some, a bridge between the living and the afterlife. While her engines no longer hum and her propellers no longer turn, the Queen Mary continues to move those who visit her, sparking the imagination and stirring the soul. Her decks, once filled with the hustle and bustle of daily life, are now quiet, but they echo with memories, as if the ship itself is whispering stories to those willing to listen. The allure of the Queen Mary is not just in her grandeur, but in her complexity. She is a ship of contradictions, elegant yet imposing, historic yet modern, serene yet haunted. She has carried people to new beginnings and borne witness to the end of eras. For every ghostly encounter, there's a story of hope, love, and adventure. For every unexplained phenomenon, there is a reminder of the ship's resilience, her ability to endure even when the world around her has changed beyond recognition. As the Queen Mary continues to serve as a hotel and museum, she remains a place where history and legend intertwine. Guests come not just to sleep in her staterooms or dine in her restaurants, but to feel a connection to something larger than themselves. They come to experience a piece of the past, to walk where Hollywood stars, war heroes, and everyday travelers once walked. And whether they leave with stories of ghostly sightings or simply a sense of awe at the ship's beauty, the Queen Mary continues to make an impact long after her final voyage. In the end, the Queen Mary is more than just a ship. She is a story one that continues to be written with each new visitor, each new memory, and each whispered tale of the unknown. She has become a legend in her own right, a place where the past never truly fades, and where the line between history and mystery is forever blurred. The story of the Crying Boy painting begins in post-war Europe, where tragedy and hardship had become an integral part of everyday life. Among the many artists who sought to express the collective emotions of the time, one figure stood out: Giovanni Bragolin, an Italian painter who became known for his haunting portrayal of a young boy, tears streaking down his face. But the origins of this now infamous artwork were far more complicated and, as some would claim, much darker than initially believed. Born as Bruno Amadio in Venice in 1911, Bragolin was deeply affected by the devastation of World War II. His early life was marked by the poverty and emotional toll that spread throughout Italy during the conflict. As an artist, he was drawn to subjects that conveyed deep emotion, focusing on the human experience of suffering and despair. By the late 1950s, Bragolin had created a series of paintings that featured children in distress, but none would become as famous or notorious as The Crying Boy. This painting depicted a young boy, likely no older than 6 or 7, with large, sorrowful eyes gazing directly at the viewer. His expression was heartbreaking, a mixture of fear and grief, and his cheeks were stained with tears. It was a striking image, one that evoked strong emotions in anyone who saw it. The boy's clothing was simple, suggesting a life of poverty, and the muted background only heightened the intensity of his sad face. Though the identity of the boy remains a mystery, many stories circulated regarding his background. Some believed that the child was an orphan, wandering the streets of war-torn Italy, while others speculated that he had lost his family in a fire. These rumors, although never confirmed, contributed to the painting's eerie reputation. Bragolin sold his painting to a British publisher in the 1960s, and it was mass-produced, making its way into thousands of homes across Europe and beyond. This widespread distribution helped cement The Crying Boy as a household name, though few knew anything about the artist or the story behind the boy's tears. At first, the painting was seen as nothing more than a sentimental piece of art, popular for its ability to evoke strong emotions. Yet, as more people acquired copies of The Crying Boy, strange events began to occur, events that would lead to whispers of something far more sinister than a mere painting. For many, the sorrow captured in The Crying Boy spoke to a universal experience: loss, hardship, and the fragility of life. Post-war Europe was still healing from the scars of conflict, and the image of a child in distress resonated deeply with a public that had witnessed unimaginable destruction. The tears of the boy seemed to represent the sorrow of a generation, one that had been irrevocably changed by the horrors of war. Art critics at the time suggested that the painting might also reflect Bragolin's personal trauma. Having lived through the war himself, Bragolin had experienced the same pain and grief as many of his subjects. Some believe that the artist infused his own emotional scars into the painting, using the image of the crying boy as a means to process his inner turmoil. Others saw the boy's expression as a symbol of innocence lost, a poignant reminder of how children were often the most vulnerable in times of crisis. As the painting gained popularity, so did the intrigue surrounding the boy himself. Though Bragolin never officially revealed the identity of his model, rumors began to spread. Some claimed the boy had been abandoned by his family, left to fend for himself in a harsh world. Others whispered that he was a survivor of a tragic accident, possibly a fire, which explained his sorrowful expression. These stories, though unsubstantiated, added to the painting's mystique. A particularly persistent rumor suggested that the boy had passed away under tragic circumstances, which fueled the idea that the painting was cursed. According to some versions of the story, Bragolin had taken in the orphan boy, only for the child to later perish in a mysterious incident. Whether or not this story held any truth, it began to influence the way people viewed the painting. No longer was it merely a depiction of sadness. It had become something far more unsettling, a potential harbinger of misfortune. By the mid-1970s, The Crying Boy had reached peak popularity in the United Kingdom. Art reproductions of the piece could be found in homes across the country, often hanging in living rooms or hallways. Its mass production meant that it was easily accessible to the general public, and it was often sold as a decorative piece in department stores. For many, the painting was simply an emotional portrait of a child in distress, a reminder of the hardships of life. Yet, as time went on, an increasing number of people began to associate the painting with a string of inexplicable incidents. Around the same time, reports began to surface of mysterious fires breaking out in homes where the painting was displayed. These incidents were particularly strange because in each case, the house would suffer extensive damage, but the painting itself would emerge unscathed. Firefighters, homeowners, and journalists alike were baffled by the phenomenon. Was it simply a coincidence, or was there something more sinister at play? In 1985, a British tabloid newspaper, The Sun, published a sensational story about a series of house fires that had occurred across the country. The headline read, "Blazing Curse of the Crying Boy," and the article detailed how homes with the painting had been reduced to ashes, while the artwork itself remained untouched by the flames. The article sparked widespread panic, and many people who owned copies of The Crying Boy rushed to get rid of the painting, either destroying it or passing it on to others. Thus, the painting's reputation as a cursed object began to take hold. The legend of the Crying Boy quickly spread, and soon it wasn't just the painting's eerie resilience to fire that concerned people. Some began to claim that the painting brought bad luck in general, attributing any misfortune they experienced to its presence in their home. Accidents, illnesses, and financial hardships were all blamed on the painting, as it took on a life of its own in the public's imagination. What had started as a simple work of art had now become a symbol of fear and mystery. But the question remained, was the curse real, or was it merely the product of coincidence and superstition? As the years went on, more and more people would attempt to answer that question, leading to a mix of skepticism, fear, and fascination that persists to this day. As the years passed, the Crying Boy painting became more than just a visual representation of sorrow. In the 1980s, strange and inexplicable events began to unfold around it, turning what was once a piece of art into something much more sinister in the public eye. The idea of a curse began to take shape, and soon enough, fear spread like wildfire. It all started with a string of house fires that seemed to defy explanation. Families who had innocently hung the painting in their homes began to report disastrous fires that engulfed their houses. In each of these incidents, the fire consumed nearly everything in its path: furniture, curtains, walls, yet, without fail, the Crying Boy painting would remain untouched, its image of sorrowful innocence emerging from the wreckage unscathed. One of the earliest known incidents took place in a small English town in 1985, where a firefighter named Alan Wilkinson was called to a house fire. By the time the fire brigade arrived, the blaze had reduced much of the home to ash. Yet, as Wilkinson and his team sifted through the remains, they found something startling. There, hanging on a charred wall, was the Crying Boy painting, perfectly intact. It seemed impossible that the painting had survived the inferno when everything else had been destroyed. At first, Wilkinson thought little of it. It was an odd occurrence, but fires often behaved in unpredictable ways. However, as he continued his work in the area, he began to notice a pattern. Over the next few months, Wilkinson responded to several more house fires, and in each case, the same disturbing detail emerged. The Crying Boy was found amidst the ruins unharmed. As the incidents piled up, Wilkinson couldn't help but wonder if there was something more to these fires than mere coincidence. It wasn't long before others began to notice the strange pattern as well. Reports surfaced from across the United Kingdom of homes that had been devastated by fire, with the Crying Boy painting always surviving the destruction. Homeowners, firefighters, and even some insurance agents started to share their stories, each adding to the growing sense of unease. In September of 1985, British tabloid newspaper The Sun ran a sensational headline that would ignite widespread panic: "Blazing Curse of the Crying Boy." The article recounted a series of house fires, all linked by one common factor: the presence of the crying boy painting. The story detailed how one family, the Hall family of Rotherham, had suffered a devastating fire that destroyed their home. In a twist that mirrored the earlier incidents, their crying boy painting remained unharmed. In the article, Ron Hall, the father, recounted how he had hung the painting in his living room as a gift from a friend, never suspecting the misfortune it would bring. The story quickly went viral in the pre-internet sense, stoking fears across the nation. The Sun even claimed that firefighters had warned people to get rid of their crying boy paintings, believing that the artwork was somehow tied to the recurring fires. This statement, while never officially confirmed by fire departments, spread like wildfire itself. People across the country began to dispose of the painting, some burning it in hopes of breaking the so-called curse, while others went so far as to abandon it in fields or dump it in the trash. The media frenzy around the crying boy painting only fueled the legend, amplifying the sense of dread that now surrounded the artwork. From that point on, the painting was no longer seen as a simple piece of art, but as a potential source of misfortune. People who had once admired its emotional depth now saw it as a ticking time bomb, waiting to bring disaster into their lives. Following the Sun's article, an influx of personal testimonies flooded the newspaper's editorial offices. Dozens of readers shared their own experiences with the crying boy, many of them eerily similar to the Hall family's ordeal. One couple from Nottingham reported that, after hanging the painting in their home, a fire had broken out in their kitchen under mysterious circumstances. Though their home suffered extensive damage, the painting remained unharmed, just like in the other cases. Another chilling account came from a family in East London. After purchasing a reproduction of the crying boy, they claimed that a series of strange occurrences began to plague their household. Electrical appliances would malfunction for no apparent reason. Light bulbs would burst unexpectedly, and the family dog, normally calm, became agitated whenever it was near the painting. Eventually, the family experienced a small fire in their living room, which, as expected, left the crying boy untouched. It wasn't just ordinary people who reported strange experiences. A pub owner in the Midlands recounted how, after displaying the painting in his establishment, the building was struck by a freak fire. Once again, the painting survived while much of the interior was destroyed. With each new story, the painting's reputation grew more terrifying, and the idea that it was cursed became embedded in the public consciousness. As the legend of the crying boy grew, so did the need for an explanation. Many believed the painting was haunted by the spirit of the boy it depicted, though there was no definitive proof that the boy had ever existed. Some claimed that the child had been a victim of abuse or neglect, and that his soul had somehow become trapped in the artwork, seeking revenge on those who possessed it. This theory, while dramatic, lacked any real evidence and was largely based on speculation. Others suggested that the painting itself was cursed, not by the boy, but by the artist. Some people speculated that Giovanni Bragolin had inadvertently imbued the painting with dark energy due to his own emotional suffering while creating it. Others believed the curse was intentional, though this theory was even less credible. Bragolin, after all, had no known ties to the occult or any practices that could explain such a malevolent force. Despite the lack of concrete evidence, the idea of the curse took on a life of its own. Paranormal investigators were called in to examine the painting and the stories surrounding it. Some claimed to detect an evil presence in the painting, while others dismissed the entire affair as nothing more than mass hysteria. The scientific community, for its part, remained skeptical, with most experts arguing that the so-called curse was nothing more than coincidence. As the curse story gained momentum, fear spread far and wide. People who had never experienced a house fire began to worry that merely owning the painting could bring them bad luck. Superstition surrounding the painting grew, with some individuals going to great lengths to avoid any association with it. Charity shops that once sold reproductions of the crying boy started refusing to accept donations of the painting, while others put up signs warning customers of the alleged curse. For many, the decision to part with the painting was driven by fear of the unknown. Even those who didn't fully believe in the curse found themselves unwilling to take the risk, and stories of people discarding or destroying their crying boy reproductions became commonplace. The painting's fate became a cultural phenomenon, a symbol of modern superstition in a world that often struggled to reconcile the rational with the unexplained. By the mid-1980s, the crying boy painting had transcended its role as a simple piece of art. It had become a cultural phenomenon, deeply embedded in the public psyche. As the stories of house fires and misfortunes circulated widely, they fueled a collective fear, turning the painting from an object of sorrow into a symbol of dread. But how did a single painting come to have such a profound psychological impact on so many people? And what was it about the cursed narrative that made it spread so quickly across communities? To understand the broader obsession with the crying boy, we must delve into the psychology of fear and how superstition shapes human behavior. The painting, through its association with misfortune, tapped into deep-seated anxieties, both personal and societal, and it became a focal point for cultural obsession. One of the most compelling aspects of the crying boy curse was the fear of the unknown that it represented. For many, the idea of a painting causing disasters was both absurd and terrifying, precisely because it defied logical explanation. Fires, in particular, are universally feared due to their destructive nature, and the image of a painting surviving such devastation was unsettling to say the least. Psychologists often explain this type of fear as a response to events that feel uncontrollable. The mind, seeking to make sense of a tragic and random occurrence, might latch onto a specific object or idea to rationalize the chaos. In the case of the crying boy, the painting became a convenient scapegoat, allowing people to attribute a cause to the unpredictable nature of house fires. Furthermore, the image itself, a crying child, elicited a strong emotional reaction. Children are symbols of innocence, vulnerability, and purity, and seeing a child in distress can provoke a deep, instinctual sense of empathy. This emotional connection to the image made the painting more memorable and, in some cases, more disturbing. The painting's sorrowful expression seemed to mirror the loss and grief experienced by those who suffered fires, reinforcing the belief that the artwork was somehow linked to their misfortune. Much of the widespread panic surrounding the crying boy can be attributed to the role of the media, particularly in how it reported on the supposed curse. When British tabloids like The Sun published sensational stories about the painting, they amplified the fear and superstition in a way that allowed it to spread quickly and unchecked. Newspapers, seeking to sell copies, often sensationalized the facts, focusing on the mysterious nature of the fires and the unbreakable curse associated with the painting. The media's framing of the story created a sense of immediacy and danger, urging readers to take action to protect themselves from the supposed curse. Headlines like "Blazing Curse of the Crying Boy" struck a chord with a public already anxious about safety, and the press played a significant role in transforming the painting's reputation from a curious artwork to a feared object. The media also created a feedback loop of fear. As more people read about the painting's connection to house fires, more stories of misfortune began to emerge. Some were likely true accounts of coincidence, while others may have been exaggerated or fabricated. However, each new story reinforced the belief in the curse, leading more people to come forward with their own experiences. The spread of these stories turned the painting into a viral sensation of its time, driven not by the internet, but by word of mouth, news reports, and community whispers. Superstition has always played a role in human culture, particularly when it comes to explaining events that seem unexplainable. The concept of cursed objects is not unique to the Crying Boy painting. Throughout history, people have attributed supernatural powers to everyday items, especially those tied to tragedy or misfortune. What made the Crying Boy stand out, however, was its timing. The 1980s were a period of uncertainty for many, marked by economic struggles and the looming threat of global conflict. During such times, people often turned to superstition as a way of regaining a sense of control over their lives. The curse associated with the Crying Boy was a modern manifestation of this age-old human tendency. People wanted to believe that by removing or destroying the painting, they could protect themselves from harm, much like how people in earlier centuries would avoid walking under ladders or breaking mirrors to ward off bad luck. Psychologists refer to this behavior as magical thinking, the belief that one's actions, though irrational, can influence outcomes in ways that defy logic. In the case of the Crying Boy, the act of getting rid of the painting was a form of magical thinking. For those who believed in the curse, discarding the artwork provided a sense of relief, even if it had no actual effect on preventing misfortune. The fascination with cursed objects is deeply embedded in human culture, from ancient times to the present day. Whether it's a cursed mummy's tomb or a haunted house, objects tied to misfortune have always captured the public's imagination. They represent a blending of fear and intrigue. People are both repelled by and drawn to these items, curious about the mystery behind them, while simultaneously wary of their supposed power. The Crying Boy painting fit neatly into this cultural narrative. As the story of its curse spread, it became not just an object of fear, but one of curiosity. People who heard about the painting's supposed powers were eager to see it for themselves, even if they didn't believe in the curse. In some cases, the painting's notoriety led to an increase in demand, with some collectors seeking out copies simply for the thrill of owning a cursed item. This obsession with the Crying Boy painting reflected a broader cultural phenomenon. In the 1980s, as paranormal shows and ghost stories gained popularity, people became more interested in tales of the supernatural. The painting's curse fit perfectly into this growing fascination with the unknown, and it became a pop culture symbol of fear and intrigue. One of the most interesting aspects of the Crying Boy curse is the power of collective belief. The more people believed in the curse, the more real it became, at least in the minds of those who feared it. This phenomenon is known as a self-fulfilling prophecy, where the belief in a certain outcome can influence actions that make that outcome more likely to occur. For example, some homeowners may have inadvertently increased the likelihood of accidents or misfortune by focusing so much on the curse. Anxiety and fear can lead to mistakes, and in a state of heightened stress, people are more likely to misinterpret ordinary events as signs of supernatural interference. A creaking floorboard, a flickering light, or an unexpected power outage could be seen as confirmation of the curse's power, when in reality, these were just normal occurrences. The more people shared their experiences and bought into the legend, the stronger the curse appeared to grow. It didn't matter that there was no scientific evidence to support the idea of a cursed painting. What mattered was that enough people believed it. In this way, the curse became a cultural reality, sustained by collective fear and imagination. As fear of the Crying Boy curse reached its peak, it was only a matter of time before skeptics and researchers began to challenge the legends surrounding the painting. After all, the idea that a mass-produced work of art could be responsible for house fires seemed far-fetched to many. While countless people were convinced that the painting held some sort of supernatural power, others sought rational explanations for the strange occurrences that have fueled the myth. This chapter focuses on those attempts to debunk the curse explorations carried out by scientists, journalists, and paranormal investigators, each with their own theories as to why the crying boy seemed to be at the center of so much bad luck. One of the most common efforts to debunk the curse came from within the scientific community. Experts in fire safety and physics began to look closely at the stories of fires involving the crying boy, searching for logical explanations that could account for the painting's strange survival in multiple blazes. One such theory centered around the materials used to produce the paintings. Many of the reproductions of the crying boy were printed on a type of hardboard, which is more heat-resistant than other common materials found in homes, such as paper or fabric. Additionally, some investigators found that the varnish used to seal the surface of the painting may have acted as a protective layer, allowing the artwork to withstand the heat of a fire. Fire investigators also pointed out that in some cases, the placement of the painting could explain its survival. In several instances, the painting had been hung near the door or in rooms that had not been fully engulfed by the fire. This positioning, combined with the fact that fires tend to move in specific patterns depending on ventilation, could explain why the painting often remained intact while other parts of the house were reduced to ash. Another explanation involved the peculiar phenomenon of fire shadows. In a typical house fire, objects located behind larger, more solid items can sometimes be shielded from the worst effects of the flames. This could explain why some versions of the crying boy appeared to be undamaged in fires where the rest of the room was destroyed. In these cases, heavy furniture or walls might have provided a protective barrier that kept the painting safe. Despite these scientific explanations, many believers in the curse were not swayed. For those who had experienced misfortune firsthand, the rational analysis of fire behavior and material properties did little to alleviate the sense that the painting held some deeper, malevolent force. While some sought to explain the curse through science, others turned to the paranormal for answers. Paranormal investigators, intrigued by the painting's dark reputation, began to conduct their own studies in an effort to determine whether the crying boy truly harbored supernatural energy. Several investigators claimed to detect unusual electromagnetic fields near the painting, which they suggested could be evidence of a paranormal presence. Others used tools such as dowsing rods, pendulums, and spirit boxes in their investigations, hoping to communicate with whatever spirit or force might be tied to the painting. While these methods did not provide concrete proof, they added another layer of mystery to the story, feeding into the belief that the crying boy was not just an ordinary painting. Some investigators proposed that the curse was tied to the boy depicted in the painting. One popular theory was that the boy had died tragically, either in a fire or under suspicious circumstances, and that his spirit had become trapped in the artwork. This theory, though largely unsupported by historical evidence, persisted among believers. According to this narrative, the boy's spirit was seeking vengeance or release, and those who displayed his image in their homes were unwittingly inviting misfortune. Other paranormal investigators pointed to the idea of psychometry, the belief that objects can absorb and hold the energy of past events or people. From this perspective, the painting itself might have absorbed negative energy from those who had owned it, particularly if they had experienced hardship or tragedy. This negative energy, according to believers in psychometry, could manifest in the form of the curse, causing the string of unfortunate events linked to the painting. While these theories were compelling to some, they did not hold up to rigorous scrutiny. There was no definitive evidence of paranormal activity linked to the painting, and most of the methods used by investigators were dismissed by skeptics as unreliable or unscientific. However, the lack of concrete answers did little to diminish the public's fascination with the painting. One of the most rational attempts to debunk the curse focused on the role of human psychology, specifically the tendency to attribute meaning to random events. Known as confirmation bias, This phenomenon occurs when people focus on information that supports their existing beliefs while ignoring evidence to the contrary. In the case of the crying boy, those who believed in the curse were more likely to remember and emphasize stories of house fires where the painting had survived, while ignoring the many homes with the painting that never experienced any issues. The repetition of these selective stories created the illusion of a pattern, even though there was no statistical evidence to support the idea that homes with the crying boy were any more likely to catch fire than those without it. Additionally, the curse's reputation may have been strengthened by the human tendency to connect unrelated events. For example, a homeowner who hung the painting and later experienced a fire might naturally associate the two events, even though there was no causal relationship between them. In this way, the curse became a self-reinforcing cycle, as each new incident was interpreted through the lens of the legend. Skeptics also pointed out that fires are relatively common occurrences, and the fact that several homes with the crying boy experienced fires was likely nothing more than coincidence. As fire investigators noted, the presence of a mass-produced painting in a certain number of homes meant that, statistically, it was bound to show up in houses that experienced fires sooner or later. The painting's reputation as a cursed object simply made these coincidental occurrences more memorable and alarming. A significant factor in the painting's cursed reputation was the role of media in spreading and amplifying the story. As previously noted, the British tabloids, particularly The Sun, played a major role in turning the crying boy into a nationwide phenomenon. The sensational headlines and dramatic stories published by the media gave the curse a sense of legitimacy that made it difficult for the public to dismiss. In the aftermath of the initial reports, the curse of the crying boy became a self-perpetuating media narrative. As more people came forward with their own experiences, the story continued to grow, feeding on the fear and intrigue it generated. This media-driven cycle of panic is a classic example of what sociologists refer to as mass hysteria, a phenomenon in which fear and anxiety spread rapidly through a population, often fueled by rumors and misinformation. By the time skeptics and investigators began to debunk the curse, the damage had already been done. The idea of the crying boy as a cursed object had taken root in the public imagination, and even those who did not fully believe in the curse were hesitant to dismiss it outright. After all, the risk of keeping such a painting seemed too great when weighed against the potential for disaster, however unlikely it might be. In the end, the crying boy painting serves as a powerful example of how modern folklore can take shape. What began as an ordinary piece of art became the subject of a widespread urban legend, fueled by fear, superstition, and media sensationalism. Attempts to debunk the myth, while based in logic and reason, were ultimately unable to fully dispel the belief in the curse. Like so many other legends, the story of the crying boy endures because it taps into deeper human fears: the fear of the unknown, the fear of misfortune, and the fear that some things simply cannot be explained. Even today, long after the fires that made the painting infamous, the crying boy continues to intrigue and unsettle. Despite the best efforts of skeptics and investigators, the legend lives on, a reminder that some stories are more powerful than the facts that seek to disprove them. By the late 1980s, the panic surrounding the crying boy had mostly subsided. Attempts to debunk the myth, along with the passage of time, had helped ease the collective anxiety that once gripped communities in Britain and beyond. Yet despite the decrease in public fear, the legend of the crying boy refused to fade entirely. Like so many urban legends before it, the story lived on, shifting from a source of genuine terror to a curious piece of cultural history. This final chapter explores the legacy of the crying boy painting, examining how it has remained a subject of fascination in popular culture and continues to be remembered by those who lived through its infamous curse. While the hysteria may have passed, The painting has left an indelible mark on the collective memory, serving as both a cautionary tale and a reminder of the power of folklore. As the media frenzy around the crying boy began to subside, many homeowners who once feared the painting felt more comfortable discussing their experiences. For some, the curse was now viewed with a sense of humor, an overblown story that had captivated the nation for a brief moment, only to lose its grip once the fires stopped making headlines. Others, however, remained wary. The emotional impact of the curse lingered, especially for those who had experienced personal misfortune and continued to believe in the painting's dark power. In the years following the height of the panic, many people who had once owned copies of The Crying Boy sought to rid themselves of the painting. Some simply discarded it, while others destroyed their copies, burning them in a symbolic act of self-protection. Stories circulated of individuals attempting to destroy the paintings, only to claim that they were unable to do so, further fueling the belief that the curse remained intact. This destruction, however, was never widespread enough to erase the painting's presence entirely. Over time, the crying boy began to fade from the forefront of public consciousness, but it never fully disappeared. The painting, with its unsettling reputation, had become a relic of its time, an object steeped in mystery, remembered for the fear it once inspired. For those who had lived through the curse, the painting's image was difficult to forget, even if they no longer believed in its supernatural power. As with many urban legends, the crying boy found new life in popular culture. In the years that followed the panic, the painting became the subject of documentaries, podcasts, and online discussions. These retellings of the curse often focused on the painting's strange journey from a mass-produced artwork to a feared object of folklore. True crime and paranormal shows, particularly those that thrived on uncovering the unexplained, frequently revisited the story, highlighting the cultural moment when the painting became a symbol of widespread unease. The legend of the crying boy also found a home on internet forums and blogs, where users debated the validity of the curse and shared their own encounters with the painting. For a younger generation, the painting became something of a curiosity, an eerie reminder of the past, but one that seemed distant and removed from their own experiences. Nonetheless, the painting's reputation for bringing misfortune continued to attract attention as new audiences encountered the story for the first time. One of the most fascinating aspects of the painting's cultural legacy is how it has shifted over time. What was once a terrifying curse has, for many, become a symbol of the irrational fears that can grip entire communities. The story of the crying boy now serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of superstition, mass hysteria, and the role of media in shaping public perception. Ironically, as fear of the crying boy painting decreased, its value as a collectible increased. What was once a common and affordable piece of decor became a sought-after item for collectors of cursed objects and paranormal memorabilia. For those interested in the occult or the supernatural, owning a copy of The Crying Boy was a way to connect with the painting's mysterious history. Some collectors viewed it as a novelty, an object with a dark reputation that could be displayed proudly without the fear that once accompanied it. Auction sites and antique shops began to see an uptick in interest for the Crying Boy reproductions, with some copies fetching higher prices than ever before. The painting had transitioned from a feared object to a coveted item, its legacy reshaped by the very panic that had once surrounded it. For many, the desire to own a copy of the painting was tied to its cultural significance. The Crying Boy was no longer just a painting. It was a piece of modern folklore. In some cases, collectors who acquired the painting were motivated by a desire to test the curse for themselves. The legend, though largely debunked, still held enough mystery to make people wonder if there was any truth to the stories. These new owners, however, were far more likely to view the painting's curse with skepticism, turning it into a conversation piece rather than a source of anxiety. The story of the crying boy offers important lessons about the nature of belief, fear, and how quickly rumors can spread in times of uncertainty. At its core, the curse of the painting was never about the object itself. It was about the human need to find meaning in chaos and to explain misfortune when the world feels unpredictable. The mass panic surrounding the painting is a powerful example of how fear can take root and spread through communities, often with the help of media amplification. In the case of the crying boy, newspapers played a critical role in shaping the narrative, sensationalizing the story and feeding into the public's existing anxieties. This is a reminder of the media's power to influence how people perceive events, and how easily urban legends can be created when sensationalism overshadows facts. Furthermore, the story highlights the persistence of superstition in modern society. Despite advances in science and technology, the human mind is still susceptible to beliefs in the supernatural, particularly when faced with unexplained tragedies. The legend of the crying boy demonstrates how these beliefs can become self-perpetuating, with each new piece of evidence reinforcing the idea of a curse, even when no logical explanation exists. Ultimately, the legacy of the crying boy is one of both fascination and caution. While the painting no longer inspires the same level of fear as it once did, its story serves as a reminder of how quickly fear can spread and how difficult it can be to separate truth from fiction when faced with the unknown. As we reach the conclusion of the crying boy painting's tale, it becomes clear that the legend will continue to endure. Though the panic has long since faded, the painting's story remains an intriguing chapter in the history of modern urban legends. Even today, the image of the crying child holds a certain unsettling power, a reminder of the mystery and fear that once surrounded it. For some, the painting's legacy is a warning about the dangers of superstition and irrational fear. For others, it is a testament to the power of storytelling, illustrating how legends can grow and evolve over time. And for those who still believe in the curse, the crying boy remains an object of intrigue, one that will forever be associated with misfortune, mystery, and the unknown. In the end, the crying boy has outlived the fires that made it infamous. It has become more than just a painting. It is a piece of cultural memory, a symbol of how fear, superstition, and legend can shape the way we view the world around us. Whether feared, collected, or simply remembered, the crying boy will continue to captivate those who hear its story, long after the flames of its curse have been extinguished. Nestled in the heart of Norfolk, England, Rainham Hall stands as one of the most impressive examples of Jacobean architecture, its grandeur both captivating and foreboding. Built in the early 17th century, this stately mansion, with its imposing brick facade and sprawling grounds, has been the ancestral home of the Townshend family for generations. Yet, the hall is known for more than just its noble history and architectural brilliance. Its name has become synonymous with one of the most chilling and persistent ghost stories in English history, the haunting of the Brown Lady of Rainham Hall. The estate's origins trace back to Sir Roger Townshend, who commissioned the construction of the Grand House in 1619. Sir Roger was a man of power and influence, a figure who had aligned himself with King James I and secured the family's place among the elite of English society. The hall was designed not only as a home, but as a symbol of the Townshend family's rising prominence. With its symmetrical lines, towering chimneys, and the characteristic mix of red brick and stone, Rainham Hall reflected the prestige of its owners. However, behind the ornate architecture and the meticulously maintained gardens, a darker legacy began to take root. The Townshend family was known for their wealth and social standing, but their history was not without scandal and sorrow. Among the most famous and infamous of the Townshend residents was Charles Townshend, the second Viscount Townshend, who lived in the early 18th century. His wife, Lady Dorothy Walpole, would become central to the chilling story that haunts Raynham Hall to this day. Lady Dorothy, sister to Robert Walpole, Britain's first de facto prime minister, was a woman of beauty and grace, known for her charm and wit in social circles. She married Charles Townshend in 1713, but what seemed at first to be a happy union soon became a source of misery. It is said that Charles was a jealous and possessive husband, whose insecurities and suspicions cast a shadow over their marriage. Rumors began to spread of Lady Dorothy's alleged infidelity, whispers that she had rekindled a relationship with a past lover. Whether these rumors were based on truth or the product of idle gossip, the result was the same. Charles Townshend was consumed by his jealousy. The exact circumstances of Lady Dorothy's death are shrouded in mystery. Official records state that she passed away from smallpox in 1726. Yet, tales from the hall servants and those close to the family suggest a far more tragic and sinister end. Some believed that Charles, in a fit of anger and humiliation, had imprisoned his wife in a remote part of the house, where she lived out her final days in isolation and despair. Others claimed that Lady Dorothy had been locked away, her mental and physical health deteriorating until her untimely death. Whether she met her end due to illness or under more grievous conditions, one thing became clear in the years that followed. Lady Dorothy had not found peace. Raynham Hall continued to thrive as a seat of power for the Townshend family, but whispers of a haunting began to surface not long after Lady Dorothy's death. Visitors to the hall, as well as members of the Townshend family themselves, started reporting strange occurrences. Faint footsteps echoing through the long corridors, inexplicable cold spots, and the sound of a woman softly weeping in the dead of night. Some claimed to catch fleeting glimpses of a figure dressed in brown, moving silently through the grand halls, her face obscured, but her presence unmistakable. The first documented sighting of the Brown Lady occurred in the early 1800s, though stories had circulated long before then. According to these accounts, a guest staying at Raynham Hall awoke in the middle of the night to find a woman standing at the foot of his bed. Her face, pale and gaunt, seemed to glow faintly in the darkness, and her eyes, if they were eyes, were hollow and dark, as if staring through him rather than at him. The figure was dressed in an old-fashioned brown gown, the fabric rustling softly as she turned and vanished into the shadows. The guest, too terrified to move, later recounted the experience to his hosts, only to learn that he was not the first, nor would he be the last to encounter the Brown Lady. As the years passed, more and more people claimed to have seen the spectral figure. The Brown Lady was often described as wearing a plain yet elegant brown dress, her features unnaturally still, save for her piercing gaze, which left those who encountered her feeling a deep sense of unease. Unlike the violent apparitions seen in other tales, the Brown Lady was not known to act aggressively. Instead, she seemed to drift through the hall as if trapped between worlds, her presence serving as a constant reminder of Raynham Hall's tragic past. By the late 19th century, Raynham Hall had earned its reputation as one of the most haunted houses in England. Paranormal enthusiasts, writers, and adventurers flocked to the estate, hoping to catch a glimpse of the elusive spirit. Some came away with nothing more than eerie stories, while others claimed to have felt a cold hand on their shoulder, or heard the unmistakable rustle of silk when no one else was in the room. The legend of the Brown Lady reached its zenith in 1936, when Captain Hubert Provand, a photographer for Country Life magazine, and his assistant, Ender Shearer, visited Raynham Hall to capture images for an article on the historic estate. During their visit, as Provand was setting up his camera in the grand staircase, Shearer suddenly shouted for him to take the picture. Provand, startled but experienced enough not to question his assistant, pressed the shutter button. It wasn't until the photograph was developed that they realized what they had captured. There, descending the grand staircase, was a translucent figure, a woman in a flowing gown, her form ghostly but unmistakable. The photograph of the brown lady became one of the most famous ghost images of all time. Experts analyzed the image, some claiming it was a trick of the light, others insisting it was proof of the paranormal. Whatever the explanation, the photograph added another layer to Raynham Hall's already rich and eerie history. Today, the legacy of the brown lady continues to fascinate and terrify. Raynham Hall remains a private residence, but the stories of Lady Dorothy's spectral presence endure. The Townshend family has embraced the legend, even as they maintain that they have experienced nothing untoward themselves in recent years. Visitors, however, are less certain. Those lucky or unlucky enough to stay at Raynham Hall still speak of cold spots and strange feelings of being watched, of a silent figure in brown appearing in the corner of their vision only to vanish when they turn to look. Raynham Hall stands as a testament to centuries of history, both real and imagined. Its stately rooms and grand corridors are filled with the echoes of the past, a place where time seems to have stopped, and where the line between the living and the dead is sometimes hard to discern. The brown lady's haunting presence is not just a tale of the supernatural, but a reflection of the pain and turmoil that has touched those who lived within the walls of Raynham Hall. Whether she is the restless spirit of Lady Dorothy Walpole or something else entirely, one thing is clear: the story of the brown lady will continue to be told for generations to come, as long as Raynham Hall stands. The stillness of Raynham Hall at night carried with it an almost palpable sense of foreboding. As the moonlight filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the floors, the once proud halls now seemed to whisper with the echoes of the past. It was during these quiet, lonely hours that those who lived or stayed at Raynham Hall first encountered the figure that would come to be known as the Brown Lady. She was not always seen, but her presence could be felt, an unmistakable sense of cold and melancholy that seemed to settle into the very fabric of the house. Servants, guests, even family members reported the same experiences: a fleeting glimpse of a figure in the distance, a chill in the air that caused their breath to catch in their throats, or the soft rustling of fabric, like a dress brushing against the floor. The figure was always described in the same way: a woman dressed in a simple but elegant brown gown, her face a pale blur, her eyes hollow and dark. One of the earliest recorded sightings occurred in the late 18th century when a guest of the Townshend family, staying at Raynham Hall for the first time, awoke in the middle of the night to find a woman standing at the foot of his bed. She was motionless, watching him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. Though she did not move or speak, her presence was overwhelming. He described her as wearing a brown dress, her features indistinct except for her eyes, which seemed to be nothing more than dark voids. Paralyzed with fear, he could only stare at her, his heart pounding in his chest. After what felt like an eternity, the figure slowly turned and drifted out of the room, vanishing through the door without a sound. The man fled the hall the next morning, refusing to speak of what he had seen. But the servants whispered, as they always did, and it wasn't long before the story spread throughout the house. Others began to come forward, recounting their own experiences with the brown lady. She was often seen in the grand stairway, descending slowly as if she were still the lady of the house, overseeing the comings and goings of her former home. Some said that her face, when glimpsed in the shadows, bore a look of deep sorrow, as though she were forever trapped in a state of grief and longing. One of the most notable accounts came from a member of the Townshend family itself. Lady Isabella Townshend, a relative of Lady Dorothy, claimed to have encountered the brown lady on multiple occasions. In her diary, she described an encounter that took place one winter's evening as she was returning to her room. The house was quiet, the servants long since retired for the night, when Lady Isabella noticed a figure standing at the top of the stairs. At first, she thought it was a servant, perhaps one of the maids finishing her duties. But as she approached, the figure turned, and Lady Isabella found herself staring into the blank, pale face of the brown lady. Though Lady Isabella was not one to believe in ghost stories, she could not deny what she had seen. The figure, draped in a plain brown dress, stood still for several moments before disappearing, leaving behind only the chill in the air and the overwhelming sense that she was not alone. Shaken but composed, Lady Isabella returned to her room and wrote of the experience in her journal, though she never spoke of it publicly for fear of ridicule. The legend of the brown lady continued to grow over the years, with sightings becoming more frequent, particularly during times of emotional distress within the family. It was as if her presence was tied to the grief and sorrow that had haunted the Townshend lineage. Some speculated that the brown lady appeared during times of great personal strife, as if she were drawn to those who, like her, had suffered. In one particularly eerie account, a young maid was assigned to clean the portrait gallery, a long corridor lined with paintings of the Townshend ancestors. As she worked, polishing the ornate frames and dusting the heavy curtains, she became aware of a figure standing at the far end of the hall. She looked up, expecting to see one of the household staff, but instead she saw the brown lady, her form slightly transparent in the dim light, her brown gown moving softly as though stirred by an unseen breeze. The maid froze, her heart racing as the figure began to walk toward her, each step deliberate, slow, and silent. The air around her grew cold, and the young woman felt a wave of sadness wash over her, so intense that it brought tears to her eyes. The brown lady passed her without a glance, continuing down the gallery until she disappeared into the shadows. The maid, overwhelmed by the experience, fled the hall and refused to return, her nerves shattered by what she had seen. These encounters, though terrifying for those who experienced them, were always marked by a strange sense of sorrow rather than malice. The brown lady seemed less like a vengeful spirit and more like a lost soul, forever wandering the halls of Raynham, searching for something or someone she would never find. Yet, not all were convinced that the brown lady was merely a figment of overactive imaginations or a lingering spirit. Skeptics among the Townshend family and their guests often brushed off the stories, attributing the sightings to overexposure to the cold drafts that seeped through the old house, or to the tricks of light that danced across the polished floors and walls. Still, the tales persisted, and those who encountered the brown lady were certain that what they had seen was no illusion. As the years passed, the sightings became so frequent that Raynham Hall earned a reputation far beyond Norfolk as a house haunted by its tragic past. Paranormal investigators began to take an interest, with some determined to prove the existence of the ghost, while others sought to debunk the myth. But regardless of whether they believed or not, all who visited the hall could agree on one thing: Raynham was a place steeped in history, its walls holding secrets that would never be fully uncovered. The mystery of the brown lady grew deeper with each passing year, her appearances seemingly tied to the emotional atmosphere of the house. If there was discord or sorrow among the family, she would appear more frequently, as though feeding off the unhappiness that pervaded the halls. It was as if the brown lady herself was a reflection of the darker emotions that had once plagued Lady Dorothy's life, and now haunted the generations that followed. By the early 20th century, Raynham Hall had become a curiosity for those interested in the paranormal. But it wasn't until the infamous photograph of the brown lady, captured in 1936, that her legend truly exploded into the public consciousness. That photograph, which would later become one of the most famous ghost images of all time, gave tangible proof to the stories that had been whispered about for centuries. Even those who had doubted the existence of ghosts found it hard to argue with the image that clearly showed a figure, draped in brown, descending the grand staircase. Yet, as with all things supernatural, the photograph only deepened the mystery. Was the brown lady truly the ghost of Lady Dorothy Walpole, trapped in Raynham Hall by the sorrow of her past? Or was she something else entirely? A manifestation of the grief and turmoil that had consumed the Townshend family for generations. The answers remained elusive, but the stories continued to be told. The Brown Lady of Raynham Hall became a symbol of the unknown, a reminder that some things, no matter how deeply we search, will always remain hidden in the shadows. And as long as Raynham Hall stood, so too would the legend of the lady in the brown dress, her story intertwined with the very fabric of the house itself. As the years passed, the legend of the Brown Lady at Raynham Hall grew stronger, with each new generation adding its own encounters to the ghostly tale. The servants, residents, and even the occasional visitor could not ignore the feeling that something, or someone, watched over the hall. The Brown Lady's appearances became less infrequent and more intense, as if the spirit of Lady Dorothy Walpole was growing restless, her ethereal presence more assertive and undeniable. The most well-documented and notorious period of the Brown Lady's haunting occurred in the early 20th century, when Raynham Hall became the subject of numerous investigations and personal testimonies. Those who had once dismissed the tales as superstition now found themselves at the center of inexplicable events. It was during this time that the Brown Lady's reign over Raynham Hall reached its peak, turning the grand estate into a place of fear, fascination, and, for many, an undeniable sense of dread. The grand staircase was one of the favored locations for her appearances. Many would later say that the Brown Lady moved through the hall as if retracing the steps of her former life, her spirit tethered to certain rooms where she had experienced the most intense emotions. It was as though she was trying to reclaim a part of herself that had been lost. Over time, these encounters began to form a pattern, but the terror that followed her appearances was never predictable. One cold autumn evening, a young governess, new to Raynham Hall, found herself alone in the grand hallway, the household having retired early for the night. She had been tasked with watching over the children, who were sound asleep upstairs. As she sat in the stillness of the great house, trying to distract herself from the unsettling tales the other staff had whispered, she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoing from the staircase. Startled, the governess looked up, expecting to see one of the family members descending the stairs. But what she saw instead stopped her breath. A faint, shimmering figure was making its way down the grand staircase, its form barely solid, dressed in what appeared to be a long, flowing gown of dark brown. The figure did not turn its head, did not acknowledge her presence. It simply moved as if it belonged to the house, gliding down the steps without making a sound. The governess, frozen in place, watched as the figure descended, its form becoming more defined as it approached the bottom of the staircase. By the time the ghost reached the floor, the governess could see her more clearly. The Brown Lady, with her hollow eyes and expressionless face, drifted past her and disappeared into the shadows of the hallway. The governess remained rooted to the spot, her pulse quickening and her skin cold with fear. She had heard the stories, of course, but to witness the ghost with her own eyes was something she had never expected. When she finally gathered the courage to move, she rushed upstairs to check on the children, only to find them still peacefully asleep, unaware of the apparition that had passed just below. The next morning, the governess shared her experience with the household staff, only to be met with solemn nods and understanding expressions. They, too, had seen the Brown Lady or heard her. It was simply accepted that she was part of the house, an entity whose presence could not be denied, no matter how much the rational mind tried to explain her away. But while the Brown Lady never caused harm to those who saw her, the encounters left a deep mark on those who experienced them. The sense of melancholy and despair that accompanied her appearances lingered long after she had disappeared. Not long after, the famous photograph of the Brown Lady was taken, cementing her place in the annals of supernatural history. In 1936, a team of photographers from Country Life magazine visited Raynham Hall to document the grand estate. Captain Hubert Provand and his assistant, Andres Shira, were working on a series of photographs for an article about the hall's architecture and history. By this point, the stories of the Brown Lady were well known, but neither of the men expected to encounter anything unusual during their visit. As they were setting up to photograph the grand staircase, Shira claimed to have seen a figure descending the stairs. He called out to Provand to take the photograph immediately, and without hesitation, Provand snapped the shot. What they captured would soon become one of the most famous ghost photographs in history. The image clearly showed a translucent figure, draped in a brown gown, moving down the stairs. The photograph caused a sensation when it was published, and while some skeptics dismissed it as a trick of the light or a photographic error, many believed it to be undeniable proof of the Brown Lady's existence. The photograph brought a renewed interest in Raynham Hall, with paranormal investigators and enthusiasts flocking to the estate in hopes of experiencing the haunting for themselves. Yet, despite their efforts, the Brown Lady remained elusive, appearing only to those who did not seek her out. It was as though she chose who could see her, manifesting when the conditions of the hall and perhaps the emotional state of its occupants were just right. Over the next several decades, sightings of the Brown Lady continued to be reported. A visiting historian staying in one of the guest rooms awoke in the middle of the night to find the Brown Lady standing at the foot of his bed, her expression as empty and emotionless as ever. He later described the experience as one of overwhelming sorrow, as though the ghost's presence carried with it the weight of centuries of grief. Despite his fear, he felt no threat from her, only a deep sadness that lingered in the room long after she had vanished. Other guests reported similar encounters, glimpses of the Brown Lady in mirrors, her reflection appearing only for a brief moment before disappearing, the sound of footsteps following them down empty corridors, and a cold breeze that would sweep through a room without explanation. The Brown Lady's reign over Raynham Hall was not one of violence or aggression, but of constant, eerie presence, a reminder that the past was never far away. Some speculated that the Brown Lady was tied to the emotional atmosphere of the house, that her spirit was drawn out by the lingering sadness and discord that had plagued the Townshend family for generations. It was said that during times of family conflict, her appearances became more frequent, as if she were feeding off the negative energy within the house. Others believed that she was a protective presence, watching over the hall and its residents, a sorrow a reflection of the turmoil that had once consumed her life. As the years wore on, the Brown Lady's appearances became less frequent, but her legend never faded. Raynham Hall remained a place of mystery and intrigue, with visitors continuing to report strange experiences even into the modern era. Though the house had changed, and the world around it had moved on, the Brown Lady remained a constant reminder of the pain and tragedy that had once unfolded within its walls. By the time the 21st century arrived, Raynham Hall had become a private residence once again, its doors closed to the public. Yet the stories persisted, passed down through generations of the Townshend family and shared by those who had once walked its haunted halls. The Brown Lady's reign may have lessened, but her presence was still felt, her story forever entwined with the history of the hall. As night fell over Raynham Hall and the moonlight cast its silver glow across the estate, one could still sense that the house was not entirely at rest. Though the Brown Lady no longer made her presence known as often as she once did, the weight of her sorrow still hung in the air, like a shadow that could never be fully dispelled. For those who knew the history of Raynham Hall, the question remained, was the Brown Lady still watching, waiting for the right moment to reappear? Or had she finally found peace, leaving behind only the echoes of her tragic past? As the legend of the Brown Lady grew, so did the number of people who wanted to uncover the truth behind the haunting. By the mid-20th century, Raynham Hall had attracted the attention of not just those with a fascination for ghost stories, but also professional investigators, both paranormal enthusiasts and scientific skeptics alike. With every report of the brown lady's appearance, the divide between believers and non-believers deepened, each side determined to prove their perspective. The first formal investigations into the haunting took place shortly after the infamous photograph of the brown lady was published in 1936. While the photograph captured the imagination of the public, it also sparked fierce debate. Paranormal researchers hailed it as irrefutable proof of the supernatural, while skeptics insisted that it was nothing more than a clever trick of light or even a deliberate fabrication. As the debate raged on, interest in the brown lady only grew stronger. By the late 1940s, Raynham Hall had become a frequent destination for paranormal researchers, many of whom came armed with cameras, audio recording devices, and other rudimentary equipment designed to detect the presence of spirits. These early investigations were often met with frustration, as the brown lady proved to be elusive, appearing only when she chose, to whom she chose. Investigators would spend hours, even days, waiting for a sign of her presence, only to leave with nothing but stories of strange feelings and unexplained cold drafts. But not all left empty-handed. A few investigators claimed to have captured unusual phenomena during their stays at Raynham Hall. One notable case involved a well-known paranormal researcher, Dr. Evelyn Harrington, who visited the hall in 1952. Harrington was a respected figure in the field of parapsychology, known for her methodical approach and refusal to jump to conclusions without solid evidence. During her investigation, Dr. Harrington and her team set up multiple cameras and sound recorders in the areas of the hall where the brown lady was most often seen: the grand staircase, the portrait gallery, and the long corridors that seemed to carry whispers from the past. They spent several nights in the house, recording everything they could. On the third night, as the team was conducting a final sweep of the gallery, one of the cameras captured something unusual. The footage showed what appeared to be a faint, shadowy figure moving through the gallery, just past one of the portraits. Though the figure was indistinct, it bore a striking resemblance to the descriptions of the brown lady, tall, slender, and dressed in flowing brown. Dr. Harrington, ever cautious, was reluctant to call it conclusive evidence of the paranormal. But the footage was enough to reignite the debate, drawing further attention to Raynham Hall and the mystery of the brown lady. For the believers, it was another piece of the puzzle, proof that the spirit of Lady Dorothy Walpole still walked the halls of her former home. For the skeptics, it was yet another illusion, an unexplained but ultimately natural phenomenon that had been misinterpreted as something supernatural. As the years went on, the investigations became more sophisticated, with advancements in technology offering new ways to capture evidence of the paranormal. Thermal imaging cameras, electromagnetic field detectors, and digital audio recorders were all employed by teams hoping to finally uncover the truth behind the haunting. Yet, despite these new tools, the brown lady remained as elusive as ever. Investigators would report strange readings on their devices, spikes in temperature, unusual energy fields, and unexplained noises, but nothing that could definitively prove the existence of the ghost. Skeptics, meanwhile, grew more vocal in their criticisms. To them, the continued lack of concrete evidence was proof enough that the brown lady was nothing more than a story, passed down through generations and kept alive by the imaginations of those who desperately wanted to believe in ghosts. They pointed to the drafty, old nature of Raynham Hall, with its creaking floorboards, uneven temperatures, and flickering candlelight as the real culprits behind the sightings. One particularly vocal skeptic was Professor Michael Granger, a renowned psychologist and self-proclaimed expert in debunking the paranormal. In 1967, Granger visited Raynham Hall with the intention of exposing the haunting as nothing more than superstition. He spent a full week in the hall, documenting every sound, every creak, every unexplained draft. By the end of his stay, Granger had compiled a lengthy report that dismissed the sightings of the brown lady as a combination of psychological suggestion and environmental factors. Granger's report, published in a widely read journal, argued that those who claimed to have seen the brown lady were likely experiencing what he called priming, the psychological phenomenon where an individual is more likely to perceive something if they are told to expect it. In other words, he believed that the stories of the brown lady had created an expectation in the minds of those who stayed at Raynham Hall, causing them to interpret ordinary occurrences as ghostly phenomena. According to Granger, the figure seen in the 1936 photograph was nothing more than a distortion caused by light, reflecting off the staircase's polished wood. The cold spots reported by visitors were the result of drafts moving through the old house, and the eerie sounds were simply the natural creaking of an aging building. Granger's conclusions, though met with approval by the skeptical community, were not enough to put the debate to rest. Even as Granger and others attempted to explain away the sightings, the experiences of those who had encountered the brown lady could not be so easily dismissed. Many who had seen the ghost insisted that what they had witnessed was far too vivid, far too real, to be the result of mere suggestion. The cold they felt when she appeared was not just a draft, but a deep, bone-chilling cold that no fireplace could chase away. The figure they saw was not a trick of the light, but a woman pale, sorrowful, and unmistakably present. As the investigations continued into the 1970s and beyond, the brown lady became a symbol not just of Raynham Hall's haunted history, but of the ongoing struggle between belief and skepticism. Each side was entrenched in their views, unwilling to concede ground. Paranormal researchers continued to search for proof, while skeptics dismissed every new piece of evidence as coincidence or error. In 1985, one of the most comprehensive investigations into the brown lady took place. Led by a team of scientists and paranormal experts, the investigation aimed to use the most advanced technology available to finally determine whether the haunting was real. The team spent several months at Raynham Hall, conducting experiments and collecting data. Their results, while inconclusive, were nonetheless intriguing. Several team members reported seeing a figure matching the description of the brown lady, though none were able to capture definitive evidence on camera. Audio recordings picked up strange, faint voices, and temperature sensors detected sudden drops in certain areas of the house. The team's final report, though careful not to make any grand declarations, suggested that there was enough unexplained activity at Raynham Hall to warrant further investigation. For believers, it was validation. For skeptics, it was more of the same anomalies that could be explained by natural causes if studied closely enough. In the end, the investigation left the mystery of the brown lady unresolved. Raynham Hall remained a place of intrigue, its ghostly legend alive and well, despite the efforts to debunk it. The line between belief and skepticism remained blurred, as it had been for decades, with both sides continuing to argue their case. As the 21st century approached, Raynham Hall became more private, its doors closed to the public. Yet the brown lady's story continued to captivate those who heard it. Her ghost was not just a figure haunting an old mansion, but a symbol of the unknown, of the things we cannot fully understand, no matter how much we try. And so, the debate raged on, with no clear winner. The brown lady of Raynham Hall continued to walk the halls, a figure caught between two worlds, her presence both undeniable and inexplicable. As time passed, Raynham Hall settled back into its role as a quiet, private residence, with fewer investigators or curious visitors coming to explore its haunted corridors. The Townshend family, who had long since accepted the presence of the brown lady, began to treat the legend more as a part of the estate's lore, something that set their ancestral home apart from other historic houses. Yet, even as Raynham Hall's doors gradually closed to the public, The legacy of the Brown Lady continued to live on in the hearts and minds of those who had encountered her story. By the late 20th century, the haunting of Raynham Hall had become a staple of paranormal culture, frequently referenced in books, documentaries, and even television programs. The photograph of the Brown Lady descending the grand staircase remained one of the most iconic ghost images ever captured, a symbol of the unexplained mysteries that continue to haunt old, historic houses like Raynham Hall. For many, the image of the spectral figure in her brown dress was proof that the past leaves its mark on the present, sometimes in ways that defy explanation. However, despite the growing popularity of the story, the Brown Lady herself seemed to fade into the background. Reports of new sightings dwindled, and the once frequent encounters with her ghostly form became less common as the years wore on. Some speculated that perhaps her spirit had finally found peace, that whatever unfinished business had kept her tethered to the hall for centuries had at last been resolved. Others believed that she still walked the halls, but that the rise of modern technology and the decreasing number of people who spent long periods of time in the house had simply made her harder to detect. Even as the Brown Lady's appearances grew less frequent, her story continued to influence Raynham Hall's identity. The house itself became a symbol of mystery, a place where history, tragedy, and the supernatural intersected. Paranormal investigators, now armed with more advanced technology than ever before, continued to visit the hall in hopes of catching a glimpse of the elusive spirit, though most left without the definitive proof they sought. Yet for all the advancements in technology and the increasing skepticism of the modern age, the story of the Brown Lady remained compelling. It was not just the possibility of her ghost that fascinated people, but the story of Lady Dorothy Walpole herself, the tragic figure who had allegedly been mistreated, misunderstood, and ultimately lost in the shadows of history. Her life, though steeped in scandal and sorrow, was emblematic of the struggles faced by many women of her time, and her supposed fate at Raynham Hall struck a chord with those who felt her story was one of injustice and unresolved grief. In the early 2000s, a new wave of interest in Raynham Hall's ghostly past emerged, spurred on by the rise of online forums, blogs, and amateur paranormal communities. People from all over the world began to share their theories about the Brown Lady, poring over old accounts, historical documents, and a famous photograph in an attempt to piece together the truth. Some speculated that the Brown Lady was not Lady Dorothy at all, but rather another woman from the hall's long and complicated history. Others theorized that she was not a ghost in the traditional sense, but an imprint of a past moment in time, something akin to a recording that replayed itself under the right conditions. As these discussions grew, so too did the fascination with the idea of the Brown Lady as more than just a ghost, but as a symbol of Raynham Hall's lasting impact on those who lived there. The hall had stood for centuries, weathering wars, political upheaval, and social change. Yet through it all, the figure of the Brown Lady had remained a constant, a reminder of the house's deep and complex history. Whether she was real or imagined, her presence had shaped the way people thought about Raynham Hall, turning it into something more than just a historic estate. It had become a place where the past was still alive, where the echoes of history could still be heard in the quiet moments. For the Townshend family, the Brown Lady's legacy was something they embraced with a sense of both pride and reverence. While they maintained that they had not experienced any unusual activity in recent years, they acknowledged the importance of the legend in preserving the hall's unique identity. In interviews, family members spoke of the ghost with respect, noting that whether or not she still haunted the hall, her story was an important part of Raynham's rich history. By the time the hall entered the 21st century, it had become less accessible to the public, its gates closed to all but a select few who were invited to visit. Despite this, the Brown Lady's story continued to be told, passed down through books, documentaries, and the occasional television special. The image of the Brown Lady herself, captured so many years ago on that famous staircase, remained a powerful symbol, a reminder that some stories, no matter how old, refuse to be forgotten. As interest in the paranormal surged in popular culture, Raynham Hall once again became a focus of attention. Television crews from around the world sought to gain access to the estate, hoping to capture something on camera that would reignite the public's fascination with the Brown Lady. Some managed to secure brief visits, during which they would film late into the night, setting up cameras and conducting interviews with the few remaining staff members who had worked at the hall long enough to hear the old stories. Though none of these ventures ever succeeded in capturing the Brown Lady on film again, the legend continued to grow, fueled by speculation and a desire to believe in something beyond the ordinary. In the end, the legacy of the Brown Lady became as much about what she represented as it was about the ghost herself. She was a reminder of the way the past can linger, of how history, no matter how long ago it happened, can leave a mark on the present. Raynham Hall, with its stately grandeur and dark history, stood as a testament to this idea, its walls a living archive of the generations who had lived and died within its confines. Whether the Brown Lady was truly the spirit of Lady Dorothy Walpole, still wandering the halls in search of peace, or simply a tale woven from the threads of fear, grief, and imagination, one thing was certain: her story would continue to be told for as long as Raynham Hall stood. She had become more than a ghost. She was a part of the house itself, as much a fixture of its history as the bricks and mortar that had held the estate together for centuries. And so, as night fell over Raynham Hall and the shadows grew long in the moonlight, the house remained silent, its secrets carefully guarded by the passage of time. Somewhere in the stillness, perhaps, the Brown Lady continued her lonely walk, her form flickering in the darkness, unnoticed by the world around her. Or perhaps, at long last, she had found the rest she had sought for so many years, her story left behind for future generations to discover and retell in their own way. In either case, her legacy was secure. The Brown Lady of Raynham Hall would never be forgotten.